shall we? Let's see if this is working. And howdy. Let's see if this is working. It has connected. We hope it stays connected. We hope it doesn't do what it did before previously. Hopefully it stays connected and stays working the entire time. We can always hope. It's always fun to hope. Let's check if the Twitch is working. Oh, why do you log me out of everything, computer? Why are you being cruel to me? Why do you make me have to find my authenticator app and everything else? It's just cruelty. Cruelty to a naval historian. Ay, caramba. Okay, so, yeah, that one. Yay, logged in. And that's working. That is working. Make sure the speakers are turned off so no noises come through. Oh. Hello everyone, and welcome to, well, one of the videos which is going to be the most strange to get into. It really is. This is the Admiralty. And, oh, as the chair's sunk down, I better make it the camera a little bit lower, so I'll just move it on. This is about, tonight's video is about the Admiralty. And it's a good one, hopefully, if I get it right, in terms of the topic. But it is also kind of a weird one, because it's going to be a multi-part live series throughout the year. There's going to be multiples of them. Kind of like with aircraft carriers of last year, the How to Build an Aircraft Carrier series, this is going to be chucked in occasionally as a live. Because this is a massive topic. I'm basically going to try and give you, through 3 or 4 lives, a version of, well, how do I put this? A version of a course which normally I would teach over about 6 weeks when I taught this course, the history of the Admiralty, of 6 weeks of, what was it, 4 hours teaching contact time with a class of 8 students every other day for 6 days a week for 6 weeks. Thank you, Twitch is working. Thanks, Leslie. And I've still got to find out whether I should be actually putting just chatting or should be putting education down on Twitch. I'm not sure if education means what I think it does. If it does, then I should be doing education. I'm putting it in. And that'd be quite fun to do. Because so far, my Twitch is all about, just chatting and various other things. But we'll see. So I have got all the settings set up and running. All the systems theoretically are working. Theoretically, the ad should be inserted automatically every 30 minutes. Theoretically, he says. And well, hello everyone. Now, also, how do I put this? Yeah, it's been a fun few days, so I do have to apologise as well for the video. I'll explain more when we get to the Shameless Book Plug section. But yeah, it's been a fun few days. So, we're talking about an organisation which doesn't come from nowhere, okay? One of the interesting things is when you start looking back, you can trace naval administration in the United Kingdom back to, well, I've talked already about the first ever admiral of the Royal Navy and how that they were commissioned and their role. I've already done a video about that on this channel. Well, what we're talking about in terms of an administrative organisation, the Admiralty can actually trace its roots back to 1414, arguably. So, please note, there are always problems with the Admiralty, but if you've got an organisation which is pretty much staying around and administering naval affairs for about, when we consider in terms of naval administration, there's been a consistent naval administration UK for roughly the last 611 years. 611 years. Now, here is the thing. I am going to talk a bit over time over the next year about some of their foreign equivalents in times, but that also depends on the quality of books. And I'd like to point out, there's a link I've pinned in the chat on YouTube. I haven't managed to pin it in the chat on Twitch. I should get that set up. I should get that set up and pinned in the chat on Twitch. And that is a book actually written by a former First Sea Lord about the administration of the Royal Navy, the Admiralty, in his time period, explaining it. Now, the fun thing is, when you're talking about these administrations of the Royal Navy, it changes a lot. It's basically a constant form of upgrade and maneuver. It's one of those things like, when I talk about the lack of a naval staff, one of the reasons you don't have a naval staff develop is because they have quite such a sophisticated civil service already for so many other things, that the reason the army formed a naval staff, forms a general staff, is because they don't have those areas covered. And please note, Poseidon, when I'm talking about an admiralty, we're not just talking about something which organises ships, etc. We're talking about something which organises and administers regular royal dockyards, which organises and administers a set force, which has a staff, has an appointment, has a regular budget. This is what we're talking about since 1414. Okay? So, yes, you've had the sink ports, you've had all sorts of organisations prior to that. Please don't think that that's me saying that before then Britain doesn't have an organised navy, and there is all sorts of things before then coming through. But the reality is, you can start training, you can start tracing the civil service organisation of an admiralty, the actual organisation and bureaucracy, to 1414. So that's when it starts to become a professional organisation, a professionalising organisation. And it's something that happens in levels and as it goes on. And that's why that book, by the way, is really interesting. I have a copy myself. Unfortunately, my copy's been nicked at the moment. It's currently being read by someone else, who may or may not watching this video. Hello, if you are, Mum. She always nicks my books. But still, it's a good book. And again, it's kind of like Nicholas Rogers books. There is a reason why Nicholas Rogers books are broken up the way they are. If I can find it. Well, there's The Price of Victory, which is the more recent one, but I'm looking for the other one, the other big fat one. I had it literally yesterday. I had it in my hand because I was double prepping this. I would put it down. There are rumours I might lose my head if it wasn't screwed on. There it is. So, this one. There is a reason why it's as big as it is, but it's also a reason why he breaks it up, why there's another one. And can I find the smaller pink one, which was that sitting next to it? Was I actually being organised? Was I putting them all together? No, I wasn't. I wasn't being that helpful. I put it in the Tudor Navy section, haven't I? It's in the Tudor Navy section. And that's all being moved around because of that. And that's being moved around because of that. And I can't find it right now. Okay. Let me put it this way. This is a 3-part series and it's still not complete. It's still not complete. They are massive tomes. Okay? And they are the closest thing you have to what you would call a general purpose reader on just the British Navy's Admiralty and the decisions. Just the British Navy's. Okay? Once you start getting into the administration of all the different navies, you get a very, very interesting purview of them. Now, what's interesting is what we're talking about in 1628 is Charles the First. Okay? Ship money is one of the reasons why civil war breaks out in the UK. Him trying to raise it from everyone. But there's also the fact that he is having to try and raise it from more people because he's making the case that it's not just the maritime counties which are affected by the sea. If you lose access to the trade networks which Britain depends on at that point, you've mucked up your entire economy. And so therefore everyone needs to support it. This is because, in many ways, this is starting to enter the phase where you have to professionalize your navies. You can no longer afford to rely upon, oh, we're going to generate this rapidly in time of war. Now, today I'm going to be talking about the office of First Sea Lord. But what is going to stay consistent amongst all these videos is these first 3 slides. In every single one, it's going to have the same first 3 slides. And then the slides after the shameless book plug are going to be different. Because every single one, I'm having to give basically the same context with a slightly different emphasis. And there's a reason to keep it the same, because to remind people are. Now, these flags are probably interesting. Okay? This is the flag of the Board of the Admiralty, which comes from the Lord High Admiral's flag. Okay? When it's placed in commission, and this is a really cool thing in the British thing, so the position of Lord High Admiral doesn't disappear. It's placed in commission, which means instead of a single person exercising the authority, they appoint the Lord Commissioners of the Admiralty. And this causes fun for the first few years because, let's be honest, when it starts off, the Sea Lords aren't the Sea Lords, they're the Naval Lords, and then there's the Lord President, who's Lord President of the Commission, and all sorts. It will be getting into all this fun. But the joy of this all is, and there is real joy in this, is that at certain points, you have something called the Navy Board, which is this flag belongs to, which is both theoretically under the authority of the First Sea Lord, but also is given a massive degree of independence, which means for many, many years, pretty much from 1546 to 1832, there is a functional civil war going on within the administration of the Royal Navy. This is where it comes interesting, because I was recently asked by someone, oh, well, don't naval crews, etc., stay on ships when they are not in commission, when they're in ordinary? And I went, no. And they went, but they're still being maintained by the Navy. Yes, but they're not maintained by the Navy. You see, when ships go into ordinary, they belong to the Navy Board, not the Navy. And whilst the Navy Board is technically part of the Admiralty, it isn't. If you see one of these flags being flown by a ship, it means one of the Sea Lords is aboard. Usually, if they are aboard, then there is someone very senior aboard that ship, and you will never see this flag aboard a ship today. Because in 1832, after many, many years, they decided to fuse the board with the Admiralty board. And how do I put this? Okay, so pretty much, Michael Coach, the Navy Board would just go, yes, you're my boss, but I'm putting you on ignore, because they were able to do that. And you'll be able to tell out why. Because this is the composition of the Navy Board. This is the composition of the Admiralty Board. Technically, the Navy Board was supposed to answer to the First Lord of the Admiralty and the First Sea Lord, or the Senior Naval Lord. Technically. But if you read that list, you'll realise that one of those is called the Treasurer of the Navy, and another one is called the Comptroller of the Navy. Thank you, hello, bearded Danish Viking, for following the channel. Hope you're enjoying yourself. And if you can imagine someone with the title of Comptroller of the Navy, who chairs the Navy Board from 1660 onwards, can you imagine the Comptroller of the Navy wanting to take any notice of anyone who claims to be their boss? Anyone? Anyone think that they're going to take any notice of anyone claiming to be their boss? No. It is really quite hilarious at various points. And yes, one of them is called the Treasurer of the Navy. And, by the way, this is one of the interesting things. You might have heard me refer to the Third Sea Lord in the past as Third Sea Lord and Control of the Navy. This is why Henderson is such a powerful person in the 1930s. Because the Third Sea Lord's post gets combined with Controller from the Navy Board and gets the same duties. And similar latitude. So remember how I tell you the Third Sea Lord is technically under the authority of the First Sea Lord, but can also tell them to go do one when they want to? That's why. So, and the thing is, here's the other really bad thing about all this. All these appointments on the board usually are double appointed. They are appointed directly by the Prime Minister, or the governor at the time, and the King. Which means they're doubly in post. So whilst they're technically the junior board, it's kind of like dealing with the Ordnance Board. Lord help the Admiralty in trying to win that fight. They will have a fight, they might get what they want, but it's going to be a challenge. So this is why when I say, yes, ships belong to the Navy, but once they're in ordinary, i.e. they don't have a commissioned crew aboard, they no longer are the Navy's control, and the crew aboard do not answer to the Navy. Because they belong to the Navy Board. Which, whilst it's technically part of the Navy, you try telling them that. Oh. So, this is one of those pieces of history where things are a mess. And they really are a mess. But it's fun to go through. And by the way, the Navy Board composition changes quite often. I'm starting off with what they're like in 1628. And I'm going to discuss at various points how they change as the series goes on. So this is what it is in 1628. This slide will be the same slide, but it'll be in 1728. the next time when I do that, and I'll show you the positions in 1728 and with any updates then, and then we'll do 1828, and then we'll do 1928 as the years go on. And how things change and how things evolve. Now, on the board, we have the Treasurer of the Navy, who is, theoretically, previously to being called Treasurer of the Navy, is called Treasurer of Marine Causes, and is the Senior Commissioner 1564 till about 1660. Okay? So, the Treasurer of the Navy is in charge of the Navy Board until about 1660. We have the Surveyor of the Navy, who was originally called the Surveyor and Rigger of the Navy. That's their original title. The Clerk of the Navy, who was originally called the Clerk of the King's Ships, and still is called, the person who exercises that role, Clerk of the King's Ships, in court circulars. So, when you see a clerk, so they will be referred to as Clerk of the Navy by everyone else, but if you're talking about a court circular, or if you're talking about someone being officially announced in the palace or in court, they'll be referred to as Clerk of the King's Ships. And don't get me started on how much fun this can cause, because, by the way, they can still be called Clerk of the King's Ships when Britain technically has a queen. Because it's one of those titles which doesn't have to change unless someone remembers to change it at the beginning of a reign. And this has caused fun for historians at certain points through history. Then we have the Surveyor of Marine Victuals. Usually a post held by two people. Officially not supposed to be part of the board originally when it's originally set up, but is added in by Elizabeth I, James I, and Charles I, and becomes such an important part of the board that it basically continues on. There is a reason why you have two people responsible for this. They're responsible for securing enough food to feed the fleet at sea, making sure they have all the stores they need for food. Now, the comptroller, and please note what it's spelt like. Comptroller. C-O-M-P-T-R-O-L-L-E-R. I have not made a dyslexic spelling mistake. I am not being a dyslexic here. That is how they traditionally spelt it. That becomes controller in the Royal Navy, but we'll leave that later when they become the Third Sea Lord. They are originally called the Clerk Controller of the Navy. And they are basically the highest administrator. And how do I put this politely? The closest thing you have to a god when it comes to organising the naval services. So whilst we might talk about the Surveyor of the Navy and the ship designs they produce in this period, and we talk about how great their designs are, and the various architects, naval architects who come up with the various improvements in ship design, that all gets done thanks to the controller. Oh, and please note, one little tidbit about a clerk in the Navy. Just remember how important they are. That was the post held by Samuel Pepys. And remember, he's the guy who comes up with the standardization system and the rating system, which then dominates how we talk about ships for the next 200-300 years after he's been alive. So I know he's famous for his diaries, but he also should be equally famous for standardizing and working out ship design and ship protocols and ship organization. And he does all that as the Clerk of the Navy. He's not on the Admiralty board, he's on the Navy board. And then we have the Keeper of the Storehouses, and that S keeps disappearing off. Yeah, that's fixed that. I'm sorry, I'll just fix this, and I'm going to save it and fix it, and hopefully it's going to fix on screen. Because that S is annoying me that it dropped down. Yes, that's fine. Now, this role was actually merged with the treasurer in 1560, which should have been a way to keep the treasurer more powerful, but as said, the clerk comptroller of the Navy, the controller of the Navy, gets a seniority, because the controller is in charge of pretty much all the logistics and auxiliary systems behind supporting the Navy, making sure it exists. And then you have Master of Naval Ordnance. Now, this is an interesting point, because technically they're assigned to the Navy Board, and technically they are there only until 1589. However, you will often have the Ordnance Board send someone to the various boards as a representative for critical meetings when they're talking about ship procurement, which means more often than not they go to the Navy Board, because they're the ones managing procurement and managing organisation of the Navy. And so whilst there technically isn't someone in the Master Naval Ordnance role, there is often people acting in that role. So we all have it. We all mildly confused because I haven't even got onto the Admiralty Board yet. Okay, I'm just talking about the Navy Board. The Navy Board is great because their roles are all described in their jobs. Okay. So then, it gets more fun. We get onto the Navy Board. Or rather, the Admiralty Board. Gotta make sure I get that. I'm not so confused. So, the Admiralty Board has the First Lord of the Admiralty, who's also sometimes known as the First Lord Commissioner of the Admiralty of the Admiralty, sometimes known as the President of the Board, or the Lord President of the Board. Various other titles are accrued. First Sea Lord. Technically originally also referred to as the Senior Naval Lord. And that's sometimes how we trace it back. Later become First Sea Lord and Chief of Staff. Then you have the second, third, fourth, fifth Sea Lords. Now, traditionally, you do have a certain number of Sea Lords. But they never had roles assigned to them. They were just Lords of the Admiralty to a Lords Commissioner of the Admiralty. And they were about organising the strategy of the Navy and keeping it going. It's only later, and when we're talking later, we're talking 1830-ish, or rather 1805, the Sea Lords start to get roles assigned to them, other than the Senior Naval Lord. So, a lot of this description, as I'm talking about, that I've got up here, doesn't apply for another, what can I say, 177 years. Takes 177 years to do it. And pretty much some of them only really get roles once the Navy Board ceases to exist. And the Third Sea Lord becomes Third Sea Lord and Controller of the Navy. So basically, he gets to become head of the Navy Board inside the Admiralty Board. Remember, I keep saying that the Third Sea Lord is an incredibly powerful position. That's because in their rush, in this period, to organise it, they literally transfer pretty much the Navy Board's powers over to the Admiralty Board. And they don't really think it through 100%. Which is one of the reasons why the Third Sea Lord post is abolished when they do the Ministry of Defence organisation in 1964. Because by that point, a lot of people had realised, both in the Navy and in government and in the civil service, just how truly powerful Third Sea Lords could be. And one of the people who hated this post most was a guy called Lord Louis Mountbatten. And he hated it most because he had been continually frustrated by Third Sea Lords on many occasions from doing what they felt were silly things. The thing is, a Third Sea Lord is often a junior admiral to a First Sea Lord. They are often junior in rank. So technically, the First Sea Lord is both their senior as an admiral and is their senior in terms of post. But as I described it before, the Third Sea Lord presents the options to the board chooses the options, and then the Third Sea Lord interprets how they implement those the selected option. And basically, outside of the actual decision of selecting which option to go for, the Third Sea Lord has a tremendously large amount of latitude by both tradition and actual role description, which means they are incredibly scary to First Sea Lords. Out of anyone in that board, the two most powerful members of it are the First and the Third Sea Lord. The Second Sea Lord has power because they're in charge of naval personnel in terms of the organisation and promotion of people and the training people, yes. But they are far more part of the purveyance of the First Sea Lord than the Third Sea Lord, because of the Navy board history. But that doesn't really matter. The naval lords, what they would call for most of the period before they become the Sea Lords, are there. They're part of it. But theoretically, the senior naval lord is in charge of operations, and the others are filling in as advisors on the board, as specialists in terms of areas, also as a way to keep admirals who you don't want wandering off abroad to go and serve someone else in case you need them for commands busy. You'd give them a position on the board. It was a nice way to give them a sinecure, keep them in the country, keep them where you can reach them, and also a good way for political connections. If you have admirals who have connections with one political party or admirals who have connections with another political party, this is a way to reward them, to maybe massage the influence. Now, the most interesting person on the board, or the Admiralty board, that we've got to really talk about is the Secretary to the Admiralty. Now, this post has been around for a very, very long time, okay? This role has been around since, as long as there's been a sort of Admiralty board and there's been a sort of First Lord of the Admiralty, there has been a Secretary of the Admiralty. They are today, well, they did become, and would still sort of extent the roles being subsumed into that role within the current Ministry of Defence team, the Parliamentary and Financial Secretary to the Admiralty. I.e., they're usually someone who is an MP. Now, over a while, they realised that it was kind of difficult for that person to be doing admin roles as well as managing the government. So whilst they usually had two people doing the role of Secretary of the Admiralty, eventually they create the second Secretary of the Admiralty, who becomes the permanent Secretary to the Admiralty, which anything you know about the UK, you will know someone who's called a permanent secretary is the senior civil servant in a department. And the permanent secretary to the Admiralty is therefore the level of civil servant in the UK, who usually has an honour which is roughly translated as "God kindly calls me God." They are powerful individuals. So, if you've been listening to this, you'll realise that there's a lot of administration going on here. There are a lot of people to provide management of what it is to generate a proficient modern navy, no matter what that time is and what modern reflects to in that time. And that's what this series is going to be about, discussing those things. Dolive 21. Why does the UK do it that way? We made a mistake in the 17th century. Yeah. That is pretty much it. Okay? We are talking about... I'm giving you snapshots into roughly 350 years of naval administration out of 611 years of naval administration. And this series is going to be basically, there's going to be one appearing almost every other month throughout the year. Okay? There's about 6 episodes I've worked out. I thought it was just God calls me God. No, God kindly calls me God is the old joke. Contron promotions and who gets what shit, more of a political side of it? Yes, it is. But you also have to remember, you can't afford to give promotions. You can't give ships to people who are idiots who lose their ships, because that makes the Admiralty board look bad. So, one of the interesting things about patronage in the Royal Navy is it never gets quite as bad as patronage in the Army, with people buying their commissions. Quite literally because A, the sea has a habit of killing them, B, there's actual exams to get positions in the Navy, and C, and this is the final one, because admirals don't like to have egg on their face, and if they promoted a dullard who loses his ship, they're going to look stupid. Yeah, there is, Knight Commander is KCMG, Kindly Call Me God. And then God Calls Me God. That's GCMG. And there is the other. It's a joke. There is. I think it's when they have 2. God Kindly Calls Me God, or something like that. It's called Grand Cross, yes. Or something. I think it's something to do with the... what's it? Okay, so there's Knights Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and George. That's the one, if I'm not mistaken, which is for the Foreign Commonwealth Office. And Knights Grand Command Cross of the Order of Bath. That was usually for people who have something to do with the Navy and various other things. And then there's the Order of the Garter and various other ones. So, in a nice way, yeah, that's a whole other honor system, video which I could do on the honor system at some point, and I probably will need to do a video on the honor system at some point to explain part of the stuff which we're going to be talking about in the Admiralty series. Lions, call me God, kindly call me God, God calls me God, God, I thought. Yeah, there are all sorts of... Once they have all the titles, it just gets confusing. But yes. So, today's topic, and it's going to be a fun one, because it is fun to do this topic, is about the First Sea Lords. Okay, we're going to be looking at them. We're going to be looking at the First Sea Lords, and what I've done is I'm not going through every single one. I've picked out 9 examples. 9 who I feel are fairly good examples to talk through. And I specifically avoided picking famous ones. Okay? I avoided picking officers who are very famous, very historic, you know, in some regards, as First Sea Lords. So it's careful. They might be famous as commanders, but they weren't famous as First Sea Lords. But they're interesting, and they give you an idea of what that position was like. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do roughly another 5 of these. I'm going to do one which is going to be about the First Lords of the Admiralty, the political heads. I'm going to do one which is about the controllers, the comptrollers, before they become Third Sea Lords. I might even carry that into the Third Sea Lord post and talk about that. I'm basically going to pick various posts. Surveyor of the Navy is going to be another good one to look at. The trouble is with the Naval Board is the Admiralty Board, as you can see here, is whilst people are lords, or the lords, and they do have different roles. This thing, before they even have the special titles, they still do specialize. They just don't have the special titles. But it's more difficult to track them down. Okay? But I might well do the Secretaries of the Admiralty as one of them. That's going to be one which I know going into it, it's going to be a weird enough one that it'll either be incredibly popular as people going, what the frig is he talking about? Or people just not go click on that. That's going to be boring. That's just going to be literally history of administration. And it's not. Here's a dirty little secret. The two people who seem to have the most active social lives, is what we're going to call it, in the history of the Navy boards, are the clerks of the Navy. For example, Pepys, who's kind of famous for having a very active social life, and the secretaries to the Admiralty, who are less famous about having it, but by golly do they have it. And I mean, if the things these men get up to in the history of them, that post has done more for producing British people than any other post single-handedly has done, which is not a medical appointment. They have been very prolific. Very, very prolific. In fact, there is a running joke in certain parts of naval history, in certain parts of history which look at this moment, that not a single one of these men, we don't know how they did it. They see that you can have the most pious, Christian, church-going, monogamous, staid, non-drinker person in the world go into this post, and you can guarantee within 6 months they will have mistresses, they will be dealing with severe, they will be practically dying of alcohol poisoning, they will be, it's just, yeah. This post is intriguing. And they never, ever retire from the post poorer than they started. But they also do a fairly good job as a rule. What I laugh is one of them, who is one of the most excessive while he seems to be in that role. Then after he's out left the role, within a year, he's being called boring again by people. And it's just, you're in this post, you're gonna have a fantastic life. Rockstar, yes. Daniel Pollux, they aren't sailors though. This is a civilian administrator of the board. Just, if you want to, look them up, okay? You'll have a fun time. Once you read between the lines and go to further history, then you'll necessarily see what is normally discussed, because normally they are bit part players in any history, because people focus in on these people, and they ignore these. And then you go and actually look in detail at these, and you're going, oh my lord, you did that? Oh, good lord. Yeah. Seriously, you know, one of them was possibly the first person in the UK to do cocaine. And I say that no realizing this is probably not Little Cousins friendly. But yeah. Clerk of the Navy is... That's Peeps. That's probably known. But the Secretary of the Admiralty are just... Yeah. You know. I'm not sure what it is. But no, it's a very, very busy role. So, are we sure? No. This is we're talking about the Secretary of the Admiralty in that post. Clerk of the Navy. Look, here is the thing, Raptorat. You've used Mistress singular here. Clerks of the Navy, Secretaries of the Admiralty, very rarely had one. They just settled for one. Controllers of the Navy are far more boring in their social lives in that respect. But that's probably because most of them seem to be absolutely worked to death. They don't have the time to do anything wrong. I think it also could be due to the age of what they are when they're doing this. Because they have a very high status position which doesn't have a lot of public attention, so they can get away with a lot. The question is then, how many people here would want to sign up to that role? Oh, and by the way, we're going to be there are a fair number of ones who are called the Casanovas of Britain at that time as well. So, these are, yeah. Actually, I will wait. So, who would like to be in any of these roles? Before we go into this and go sort of that, which role would you like to be? Now I've described them all. Surveyor of the Navy takes care of ships and all these sort of different roles. Which one of these jobs would you like to be in? I'm not sure if John Stonehouse was parliamentary secretary to the Royal and financial. Just remember that they're parliamentary and financial secretary to the Admiralty. Parliamentary and financial secretary. I think it's combining the two. Politics and money combined is just the ultimate aphrodisiac of power. Be Charlie Sheener. So yeah, these are they're interesting jobs. They're interesting jobs, and yeah. It's the interesting part of naval history. We're going to be talking about the admin side, and the management side, and the leadership side, and how it works. Right, I think because my mind is Treasurer of the Navy. Oh, you'd enjoy the Treasurer of the Navy, because there were all sorts of things which came with that role, which were fun. Now, by the way, the Treasurer of the Navy continued to post till 1836. And they had overview of the Navy Pay Office and the Department of the Accountant General of the Navy. The Navy Pay Office, now, that's a section. That is a section, the Navy Pay Office. And they had their own accommodations on Broad Street. He had a staff. The Accountant General Navy reports to him. It's a fun posting. You only just have to look up their addresses throughout history. They eventually get Somerset House. They are the ones who do a lot of building. Quick question: how many died in post? A few served for quite a while. But yeah, Treasurer was a good role. How many died in post? A fair number served the post for a long time. They really do. So as said, today's discussion is going to be about the first Sea Lords, or the senior naval lords, and what they did, and how they won. And, well, you know, what they got up to in terms of their roles and how they learnt to do their roles. Now, the thing about Pepys is he has multiple patrons. But realistically, he managed to dance between Charles II and James II, and managed to do all sorts of things in terms of administration thanks to the Parliament as well. So he has dances between patrons. Oh, basically because Alex, that if you want to explain that, why it's a Sea Lord. Okay. Here's the big bit of interesting history in here. So they start out as Lords Commissioner of the Admiralty. So they start out as Lords Commissioners. Prior to that, they were senior member to the Lords Admiral Council. Prior to that, it was the Lord Admiral's Council. And there are various points to which the Board of Admiralty, Naval Lords, and all these things, they're Lords Admiral. They're always Lords, because remember, their original position is the Lord High Admiral, the Lord High Admiral of England, who's in charge of the Navy. That's the original stuff. And it's his post which is put in commission. So they are Lords. They are exercising the power of a Lord in the role. So like there are Lords of Land and Feudal States, the British system in the time period when they're setting up Lord High Admirals. And by the way, this goes back to Edward the First. Just for some fun here, Edward the First. He thinks in terms of lords, so he sets it up as lords and sets up a lord. And so when they put the position into commission, they get these titles get farmed out. So the Admiralty Board, which takes on the Lord High Admiral's role, there was the Navy Board was already come into existence to support the Lord High Admiral. Lord High Admiral gets turned his post in commission. They become lords because they're exercising his position. And then eventually they get turned around all the things, and eventually it becomes the Sea Lord. Mainly because you have the First Lord of the Admiralty. Neither was allowed to be called the Navy Lord because they were all the Navy were combined. So you wanted First Lord of the Admiralty was the civilian side. So if you're a Lord of the Admiralty, you're an out. The Navy guys wanted something which was going to make them differentiate. So calling themselves a Sea Lord meant that they were professional service. They were part of the Navy. They weren't a civilian appointee. So yeah, that's where it all comes from. But for that, well, if I just open up this, I did a video about him not that long ago, actually. William de Leybourne, which is a 30-minute long video which came out on the 8th of January, 2025, which was literally is called William de Leybourne, the First Admiral, and it explains his appointment and his role. So yeah, hope that helped. Hope that answered the question. So what's today's discussion about? It's about the First Sea Lords, what they got up to, and some of them. Shameless plug. Now, I have to apologise because some videos haven't made out on time. There is a video, Togo Haichiro is coming out tomorrow. The video which was supposed to be Wednesday is going to come out next Wednesday now. The video which was supposed to be a little bit before that, I think last Saturday's video, is going to come out on Monday. And all this is because we've had the back wall get blown down in the storm, the back wall and fence get blown down in the storm. And I've also had some fun. It's like so my cousins and I, we have my cousins, especially the ones who are younger, the ones who are sort of 25 and below. In this case, it's 15, heading into her GCSE year. We have a system. They can send me a variation on. They can send me a text message. As long as they tell me where they are, I'll always go pick them up without asking questions. But I'll make sure they're okay. We have a message. The thing is, 990 means come pick me up quickly. But I'm bored. 999 means call the police as well as coming to pick me up. We'll have a race between me and the police to see who gets there. And the variations 1 through 8 basically go from bored to in danger but don't need police. So I got a 996 message this last night, actually. And so that's why there was no Twitch stream last night. I went. There had been supposed to be a study session at a quiet person's house, and that had all been fine, but some boys from the school who were less quiet decided to invite themselves over, and everyone was being very polite, but there were no parents there. And so I ended up giving an impromptu history lesson on the Viking Blood Eagle last night at 8:30 in the evening, and then sending some young boys off home, and then helping them with some more history and politics stuff, and then got my cousin home. That was fun. It's the joy of living closer family being arranged to this, but yeah, that's sort of, it's been a bit of a apology from me for not delivering on what I normally do for you, but I've had the reasons. Medi, do they have to have the title Lord to have the position? Nope. They don't have to be even knights. They're just a Lord Commissioner. Their entire title of Lord comes from their position, not their pre-feudal rank. And yeah, pretty much it is, Alex. It is that it's the Lord High Admiral it's basically like the Navy Minister, but it's how you work it in a feudal society. Yeah, Blood Eagles were the rage well before the First Sea Lord, but they're a fun thing to talk about, to explain how the people who they were subject to were alive the whole way through, thanks to alcohol, which the young men wanted to imbibe. But I explained that the alcohol they were imbibing was nowhere near strong enough, but if they wanted to, I would gladly help them find some, so I could give them a practical demonstration. If anyone wanted to volunteer. No, it was really quite funny. Basically, boys heard girls were getting together to study, no parents, and they thought they could go round and it would be something other than studying, and were most disappointed when they realised the girls wanted to study. Even more disappointed when someone turned up to teach. Oh. To be fair, one boy did stay the entire time for the teaching and actually apparently found it very useful, and ended up getting a message that they found it very, very useful. Yeah. Yeah. At least one of them has told my cousin that their elder cousin is scary. And smiles the whole time he's saying it. Oh. So, here is our starting point. Edward Russell, the first Earl of Orford. Okay? First Earl of Orford. Now, he is fun to track down because he confuses even some historians. Okay, I have this. Because the naval historians usually are okay, but there are other historians who touch on him because of his societal and political actions and go, so he was first Sea Lord of these. No. What was he then? Well, he's the senior naval lord, 1690 to 1691. Then he's senior naval lord and first lord of the Admiralty. He exercises both posts. May 1694 to May 1699. And then he's first lord of the Admiralty, November 1709 to September 1710, and October 1714 to January 1717. He is... How do I put this? He is a very interesting character. And please, if you have a chance, I will say this. He's one of those people who, when he comes up, people look at him and go, how did he do this? How did he do this? He has some actual experience. Now, I would point out that sometimes when they look up this post, they think it's Robert Walpole. Because it was created, this period was title was created again in 1742 for Robert Walpole. But he was Earl of Orford. Russell was made the Earl of Orford in 1697. He dies in 1727 with no children, so the title becomes extinct. So both he and Robert Walpole and Horatio Walpole in 1806 are all the first Earls of Orford. Lions, No, Lions, before you... the nicest way, there is an NCO corps in the Navy at this period. There is an NCO corps. But you won't... They're not going to mention in terms of the board's position. Getting into the NCO leadership of the Royal Navy in this period, the non-commissioned officers, because you have the... Okay, you have commissioned officers who have a commission. Then you have officers who have a writ. Not a commission. So non-commissioned officers. And there'll be people like the master of the the sailing master. There'll be people like the senior carpenter, various positions, leading hands. It gets okay. So do not think at this point there are literally officers and sailors. There are non-commissioned officers who have warrants, or well, have writs on earlier point and then it's later warrants, and that's where we get warrant officer from, because they have a warrant. Rather than having a commission from the Crown, they have a warrant from the Admiralty, or a warrant from the Navy Board. Okay, so we'll get into those. We'll get into non-commissioned officers, and that's a whole other set of videos, alright? Okay. Edward Russell is a really fun character. He was also Lord Lieutenant of Cambridgeshire, Member of Parliament for Cambridgeshire, Member of Parliament for Portsmouth. He served as Treasurer of the Navy, March 1690 to October 1695. So think of that. While he is Senior Naval Lord, and also whilst he's Senior Naval Lord and First Lord of the Admiralty, he's also Treasurer of the Navy. Okay? So at a certain point, he is Senior Naval Lord, First Lord of the Admiralty, and Treasurer of the Navy. Basically from May 1694 till late in 1699, May 1699, he is all free. So there are 3 different posts which are supposed to be held by on those boards, across 2 boards. There are 3 posts, and he holds all 3 of them. So he has all 3 votes. So if we go back to this role here, technically in this position, he is a deputy to the Comptroller of the Navy. So on the Navy Board, he's Deputy Controller of the Navy. But on the Admiralty Board, he is technically the Controller of the Navy's boss. Because he's both the First Lord of the Admiralty and the Senior Naval Lord. Conflict of interest is Edward's middle name, okay? So this is why people who don't have the time to spend their lives studying naval history get confused by this guy. I would love to say he was unusual in this post, but he's not. Okay? He's not unusual to this. So he is also one of the Immortal 7, okay? The people who write to William, Prince of Orange, asking him to depose King James II. So he's one of the people who brings William of Orange across to replace James II. He's how do I put this? He is an interesting officer. He was promoted to captain in 1672, and he's promoted to full admiral in May 1689. So he jumped straight from captain to full admiral. The Brook. So if the Admiralty, no, he has 2 votes on the Admiralty board and 1 vote on the Navy board. But he's technically the boss of the controller, who is the head of the chairman of the Navy board. The Brook, you have to remember that there are 2 boards running the Navy at this point. Technically, the Navy board reports to the First Lord of the Admiralty and the First Sea Lord. Or the Senior Naval Lord, as they're normally called in this period. But he is also Treasurer of the Navy Board. How do you confuse my Edward Russell? Don't worry, I will explain it again. I didn't add the treasurer thing to his role up here. He serves as Commander-in-Chief of the Channel Fleet at various points. He's commanded HMS Phoenix. He's commanded HMS Newcastle, a 4th rate, a 3rd rate, HMS Swiftsure, a Defiance, which was a 3rd rate, and Phoenix was HMS Phoenix was a 5th rate, and HMS Reserve, a 4th rate. He had some experience. He had served well. Don't worry, that most people are going to be confused by this guy. Now, when he is promoted to Admiral of the Fleet in December 1690 as well. And it's an interesting position at that point. So, Admiral of the Fleet in this period basically means he's been promoted to the Senior Admiral in the Royal Navy. It's not even technically always called Admiral of the Fleet. If I give you an example, the original title, which is accorded to Admiral of the Fleet, now we can trace back to John de Beauchamp, who was the first Baron Beauchamp de Warwick, who was appointed Admiral of the King's Southern, Northern, and Western Fleets, which basically means he's been appointed a Senior Admiral in the Navy. And it's the same with what happens to Orford in 1690. He's appointed Senior Admiral in the Navy. Now, the reason he's forced to stand down as a Lord Commissioner in 1691 is because of the Dutch because he blamed the Dutch for failing to blockade France because they didn't do a good job, and so he's then put in charge of the Anglo-Dutch fleet that fights the French at the Battle of Barfleur. Now, for those who don't know, the Battle of Barfleur is quite an interesting battle because the British and the Dutch bring 82 ships of the line to the fight with 3 fire ships. The French bring 44 ships of the line and 2 frigates and a fire ship. And, somehow the combined Anglo-Dutch force wins. Can't think why. I might do that as a video between the 20th of May, 4th of June, because that's when that battle. Basically, the battles of Barfleur and La Hogue is often combined into, because they take place between what in our calendar would be the 29th of May to the 14th of June. To their calendar were the 19th of May and 4th of June. I demand to talk to your superior. Request must have been like... Well, basically, his superior is himself. His command tree is a circle. You basically, the only one you can find to outrank him consistently is the king or queen. If you can find them. One of the interesting things to think about is that if you look him up, and you think about his status in the Royal Navy, and you look at the battles he's done, you would kind of wonder if ships were going to be named for him. And there are quite a few named HMS Russell for him. He has had 5, almost 6, but 5 ships definitely named for him. And the most recent was launched in 1954. Thanks, Dacres. So he deserves it. Okay, or his wife. I don't think Russell was ever married. He might have been. He didn't have any children. Oh, he did. He was married to Lady Margaret. Sorry, I'm mistaken. He never had any kids, as far as we know. When he does resign in 1692 as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, as Senior Admiral, he actually has to be replaced by three officers to fulfill his work. He's found to have been so effective at this job, they have to replace him with Killigrew, Naval, and Chauvel. And here's what happens. They do so badly between them at the Battle of Lagos and the various other options that they are all 3 dismissed, and Russell is brought back with people going, please come back. So they try and replace him with 3 officers to try and try equivalent him in the aggregate, and they still fail, and they have to bring him back. I mean, this man is a living proof that maybe Moneyball is not quite right. Maybe you cannot make up for an individual in the aggregate with other people working together. Or maybe you can. I'm not sure. He is... how do I put this? He is, though, very much a Whig. Okay? The forerunners of the Liberals, and then who are now today the Liberal Democrats in British politics. And he is very associated with them. And that's one of the other things which explains his success, because the Tories... he plays politics. He really does. About who he promotes and how he promotes them. But he does well. Oh yeah. Sorry, I just quickly checked my notes and went down because I, of course, said he wasn't married. No, he married his cousin. He married his cousin, Lady Margaret Russell, who was the youngest daughter of the 5th Earl of Bedford. He married her in 1691, which would mean he was 34 at the time. Joint commands can work, but you need to work out the structure of the joint command and who's in charge and what they're doing. He faced allocations for misappropriated funds from the maintenance of fleet and all sorts of things throughout his career. But the trouble is, who's going to investigate him? How close cousins? Very close cousins, Dacres. He did all sorts of interesting things in terms of reforming naval organizations. One of the things he does is does a lot of building of infrastructure. Now, he also builds his estates quite finely, and you will often find the same people who are building the infrastructure for the Navy are also building his estates, which could lead you to think there is corruption going on here. But the trouble is, and this is one of the small problems, when they petition the treasurer to investigate him, he is the treasurer. When they petition the comptroller to investigate him, he's the comptroller's boss. And all sorts of other situations. Now, what does he set up? What's his lesson leadership? What is his leadership style? Well, why is he so effective? Russell is one of those officers who knows his people. Oh yes, the Russell family does produce all sorts of interesting things, Echo. But they're not his children. He's a offshoot which ends. Russell, as a leader, practices the policy of knowing his people. He knows his ships, he knows his people. And that's how he basically manages to get the fleets to work. One of the problems, and one of the reasons why he's dismissed, but soon brought back, when he complains about the Dutch, is he's not wrong, and he's able to back up what he says. He's corrupt, certainly. I'm not gonna jump around that. There are so many suspicions I put, but he's not to the point of it. He's not so corrupt that he's causing a problem. He's corrupt to the level that makes the system work in this period. You're not going to get an appointment just because you're a Whig. You're only going to get an appointment because you're a Whig and good at your job. He does let Tories advance in the Navy. He does support them when they are good at their job. It's the beginning of some sort of professionalism with him. And again, there is an argument that one of the reasons why he has the people who are doing construction work, etc., on the various yards and working on them also work on his estates, is it gives him a very practical eye view of what the quality of work they can do. And there are more than a couple of occasions where he seems to tell people that, well, why have you done that on my estate but not done it that way on the Navy yard? I think you should change it, shouldn't you? And they've changed it. Which is where some of the allegations of corruption actually come from, because some people basically complained that they did this for him and then he still didn't give them the job. It's one of those things when you're looking back in leadership in this period and what is he doing. He also likes to fly his flags. When he does, he picks things that are second rates, or very rarely does he seem to pick a first rate as his flagship. He prefers third rates. He prefers smaller ships which are more manoeuvrable and allow him to better monitor battle, in his view. HMS Duke is especially one which he enjoys. She's a 90-gun second-rate ship of the line, which had been launched in 1678. And he picks her in 1689 as his flagship for the blockade of France. He likes to pick her again when he has the chance. Well, you see, yeah, that might make you wince through on, but the thing is, it's... how do I put this? I don't like it in terms of a method I don't like corruption, but if you consider the period that they were living in a way it's a smart policy, because does he have enough of a mechanism or system to do building control? No, he doesn't. He'll have people watching things, but will they really know what they're doing? Will they be reliable? Can he trust them? He can only really trust his own eyes. Can he go there enough to be watching it in the first place? No. But when he goes on his visits, he can compare what they're doing on visits to what they did on his property. So I don't like it. But in a way, he's making the corruption work for him. rather than work against, he's making the corruption work for him, work for the Navy, then, you know, yeah, I can agree. You wouldn't want to be on another comment. He's making the corruption work for him in a way, work for the Navy. Will you cover anyone on this in the series? Look, Daniel, please note, what we're talking about when we're talking about this level of naval leadership is there is a significant amount of politics in it. For example, I'm going to talk about one who I talk about regularly, because it doesn't really, when I talk about Third Sea Lords and I talk about Admiral Henderson, he was a profoundly honest man, a profoundly good man. He wanted the best for the Royal Navy in what is and definitions when he needed to serve the Royal Navy and get what he needed out. The point is this: the good Sea Lords and good members of the boards and members of the Navy board, etc., they learn very quickly. They can't change the system. They have to get the best out of the system as is. Only the people above them can change the system. Only the parliamentarians, only the government can change the system. So they have to learn to operate the system that they're dealing with. They can't afford to go into it. The ones who tend to do badly in this role, and I haven't picked him out because, honestly, I'd be sitting here the whole time complaining about him, is the people like St. Vincent, who go in believing they can change the whole system, root and branch, to make it a perfect system. You can't. Because you can't change the wider government. That's not within your purview. In this period, well, we are looking at we are going to be covering right through to the 1930s today. So yes, we are going to look at some who weren't embezzling, but in this period, there's always going to be a little bit. But with Orford, as said, I'd say what he was doing was within the acceptable latitude of the time. In that, I look back, I won't consider him a particularly egregious or bad one for it. No, Admiral Guards didn't need to be tipped to get in the door. That is a myth. But it was a myth which the Admiralty Guards certainly helped start, and they never opposed getting money. But they didn't expect money to get through the door. If you were supposed to get in the door, you could get in the door. You needed an invitation to get in the door, so usually that meant you need to make friends with someone on the inside who could give you an invitation. You weren't just able to walk in off the street and go, I want to go in. No. But the guards would quite happily, if you believed that as you went in you had to grease their palms by, shaking their hand and give them some coins while they're doing it, they wouldn't say no to the money. They just didn't expect it to get in, and you giving it to them if you didn't have an invitation wouldn't get you in. So it's that kind of scenario. So it's sort of expected. Yeah, it's sort of expected. And one of the things is you're doing, the corruption needs to improve is, in many ways, because those same companies are often put forward they might have political patronage themselves. So let's say you've got a builder who's competing for a contract. They might well be put forward by a member of the government who's not in the Admiralty. So they will be, that member of the government is their patron, and in return they might receive some support from that builder. Now, if he turns them down without good reason, that's going to make their patron upset, and he's going to have to deal with that as a political issue. So he has to find a way to manage them and get the best out of them so he gets the best from the country. So if he then goes, well, yeah, but, I need to sample your work first, and there's this, I need an extension done on my estate, or I need something like that. I need some buildings built. And they, of course, it's the Snell system, they go do it. It passes his inspection, great. That's fine. The contract is yours. Then when they're building it and they're doing something which he doesn't like, he goes, well, Why don't you do it? He's now got a reason to question them, which will also not embarrass the patron, because the patron can arouse, well, I thought they were a good quality builder because they've done good work for me. They have now done shoddy work for the government. This is terrible. I wash my hands of them. And so he doesn't get into trouble in the system. The patron doesn't get into trouble, which prevents him from getting in trouble. And everything can rest on the builder if you do it the way he does it. So it's working within the system that is there. Now, there are royal shipyards. They're also occasionally commissioned from private shipyards, but honestly, most of the ships built are going to be built in the royal dockyards. Okay, so does that explain the... Are we happy with the Earl of Orford now? Because I've got someone else to move on to who's going to cause you some fun as well. Oh, private contractors. Oh, there were private contractors. But you have to remember also in this time, because the Royal Navy had its own shipyards and could build its own ships from scratch, which they could do right up for quite a while. Look when the last naval dockyard closes down. It's well after World War II. If a private contractor tried to charge too much, they had people who built everything so they could check their prices. That was one of the reasons why the Royal Navy kept naval dockyards going. The biggest thing for them was, well, how do we check their prices and what they're charging is reasonable if we don't have the knowledge ourselves? This is why we have these naval dockyards. And also they tended to build the biggest the best. And it's one of the reasons why I tend to argue these days that when you've got a de facto monopoly situation where the government is basically their only customer, building warships in those yards, and so you've got a sole source supplier and a single customer. Should you really have those yards run as a private industry? So, now we're going to talk about George Byng. And this is not the one who gets himself executed. This is his dad. This is why Byng didn't think he would get executed. Now, he has an impressive naval career. He has an impressive naval service. He had commanded HMS Constant Warwick, HMS Hope, HMS Duchess, HMS Royal Oak, HMS Britannia. You know, he has a whole list of ships, that he's been in charge of. Constant Warwick, by the way, was a privateer, originally, built for the Earl of Warwick and then bought into the Royal Navy. It was hired for parliamentarian service by the Navy and all sorts of things. It's a fun one. And then HMS Nassau and also the Mediterranean Fleet. He took part in the Battle of Beachy Head during the 9 Years' War. He took part in the Glorious Revolution. He took part in the War of Spanish Succession. He was at the Battle of Vigo Bay, the Battle of Malaga, the Battle of Toulon. And he was in the War of the Quadruple Lance, the Battle of Cape Passaro. Now, Byng is politically connected again. Okay? In 1688, he delivers a letter, hand delivers it, from various captains to Prince William of Orange when he landed at Torbay, assuring the prince that the Royal Navy captains of those important ships would give him support. And it was the prince's response to Byng, which meant the Royal Navy switched allegiance to William of Orange rather than supporting James II. Take care, KVG. So there's his political connections already early on. It shows the Prince William of Orange that he is a man trusted by members of the naval service. He's also able to be trusted by the future king. Now, if we think about that, in 1688, he's a lieutenant. Within 15 years, in 1703, he's promoted to Rear Admiral. Think about that. Lieutenant to Rear Admiral in 15 years. HMS Britannia was a first rate as well. He commanded... Byng... Now, here's the thing. Byng, when he commanded HMS Britannia, he commanded her as her flag captain. Guess who he was flag captain to? Guess who taught him how to be an admiral? Anyone want a clue? He was flag captain to Edward Russell. So Byng, yeah, Lions, was Russell's flag captain. This is important. This is a critical duty. He's flag captain to the senior admiral. And that gives him a good promotion. He is already on a very good track. And, well, when he is taking part in various operations, he led the bombardment squadron while serving under Admiral Rooke at the capture of Gibraltar in 1704. Took part, as I said, in the Battle of Malaga in August 1704. When he was promoted to Vice Admiral in January 1705, he was also, in that same year, elected as Member of Parliament for Plymouth. And please note, Plymouth and a few other places are the Navy parliaments, members of Parliament. Basically, the Navy has such a powerful block vote in certain areas that the Navy picks the MP. Yeah, it's almost like Russell trained him and selected him, because First Lord of the Admiralty, November 1709 to September 1710. Senior Naval Lord, October 1710 to September 1712. Basically comes in afterwards. He's trained up by Russell. He comes in by Russell. Now, his fourth son, I think it's his fourth. He and his wife, by the way, and this is the other thing about naval loss in this period. Okay, he married Margaret Master. That was his wife. And they had 15 children. 11 boys, 4 girls. Only 6 lived after him. Yes, he is Russell's protege. John Byng, who dies in 1757, 14 years after George Byng had died, is the one who gets executed. Now, he's an interesting one because he's the senior naval lord in 1710. If you think about that, in 1710, he's the senior naval lord on the battle on the board of the Admiralty, been put in there by the Earl of Orford. He joins the board. He joins the board of the Admiralty board under the Earl of Orford's leadership. He becomes senior naval lord in October 1710. He's a full admiral by 1708. So he'd been a full admiral by for 2 years by that point. But again, think about this: he's gone from rear admiral to full admiral in 5 years. He gets reappointed a lot. Whenever Orford comes back, he comes back as senior naval lord. In 1717, he commanded the British fleet in the Baltic. And he's promoted to admiral of the fleet, or rather the equivalent at this point, in 1718. Commanding HMS Barfleur. Now, if we think about HMS Barfleur, she was named for Russell's Battle. What would be a normal time period for doing that promotion? Well, that's the thing. There isn't really such a thing as a normal time period in this era. It's an absolute mess. It is a lot of political appointments, but also luck. If you're involved in a battle, you could get promotion, and if you've got a good patron, you've got promotion. He's got the Earl of Orford. He has got the Earl of Orford because, again, George is similar to the Earl of Orford in that they're not selecting people who are going to try and be no corruption, because that doesn't work. They're selecting people who have an acceptable approach to corruption. Okay? In a system which is going to be corrupt no matter what you do, you have people who can make corruption work for the Navy. You have people whose corruption would undermine the Navy. You have to find the former and avoid the latter. Technically, promotion was supposed to be based on seniority, but it doesn't really work like that. Now, he commands the Royal Navy at the Battle of Cape Passaro. Now, have you heard of the Battle of Cape Passaro before? The odds are probably not. It takes place in August 1718. Okay? Yes, power corrupts, but the question is, are you going to be the type who's going to let power corrupt absolutely? Usually, and I would say this is the point I would make about the secretaries of the Admiralty Board, etc. They usually pick very pious people for whom the power corrupts absolutely. But if you're already a slightly corrupt person, you might actually be less likely to become more corrupt because you've got into a habit of what is your acceptable level of corruption that's safe for you. I.e., you found the boundary, you're not going to push over it. So when you're a little corrupt, you found your boundary, you don't push beyond it, because you know what's safe. And then you put in a more powerful position, you keep within that boundary, because that's the habit you formed. But when you have no corruption, and you get put in a position of absolute power and authority, where everyone's throwing gifts and things at you, and that's how you do a lot of your deals, is through that communication and that patronage, that overwhelms you. Exactly, Mark Arms. Bad corruption. The money for new ships is missing. Good corruption. I won't ask you how you got these guns for us. Yes. So, why is this battle, the Battle of Cape Passaro, so interesting? Well, the British come with 22 ships of the line. The Spanish have 15 ships of the line. The British have they don't have any frigates with them, but the Spanish do have some frigates with them. And the Spanish lose a lot of ships. 10 ships of the line are captured. 4 ships of the line are destroyed. 4 frigates are captured. So they start off with 15 ships of the line. 4 get destroyed, 10 get captured, 1 gets away. They start off with 6 frigates, 4 get captured. That is a glorious battle. That is an absolutely glorious battle for its time. But it's part of the War of the Quadruple Alliance. It's possibly the most significant action of the war in terms at sea. But if you start talking about the War of the Quadruple Alliance, most people look at you and go, what are you talking about? What war? And it's this war from 1717 to 1720. It's the war which leads to Austria giving Sardinia to Savoy and Sicily to Austria. Think about that. Sardinia cedes Savoy, cedes Sicily to Austria after this battle. Sicily. After this war. You have Austria, Britain, France, and Netherlands against Spain. Theoretically. Don't ask Clarke. Part of the system was that someone was with patronage, you could charge more than the market rate, but you still had to deliver quality goods and services. If you do not, you would never get another contract because you embarrass your patron. Pretty much. Which again is where this whole thing of having people come and do some private work for you on your estate comes in. Because if they do the work for your estate and it's good quality, and then you go, you're not doing the same quality you did on my estate on this naval dockyard. So he's a really interesting person in terms of battle. And Battle of Cape Passaro is another battle which I really should do some talk about, because again, there are so many of these naval battles which, frankly, it's just they never get talked about. They really don't. Once you get beyond Trafalgar, most people go, well, I haven't heard of this battle. And you go, well, that's because they don't get talked about. The Great Age of Sail battles, the Spanish Armada, all these things, they don't get discussed. It's a really interesting battle, Passaro. And in 1721, when he finishes being senior naval lord for the last time, he is made a privy councillor. Or rather, no. In January 1721, in the same year, he's made a privy councillor. Now, if you're made a privy councillor, that's an important thing. And also, I should point out, Byng had also served as Treasurer of the Navy. But, let's put it this way. He was Orford's pick for Treasurer of the Navy. And when you're made a Privy Council is technically a body of advisors for the sovereign. Now, Privy Councillors are technically a group which the sovereign can call upon to advise them. So you're a trusted person. They might call individually, they might call a small group, they might call a full Privy Council. It's very rare. When you hear things like orders in council come out, that's a Privy Council order. Okay? It's technically the monarch has parliament, etc., to run the country, but if there's something really contentious and they're worried about it, and they're not sure what to do, they can technically call in the whole Privy Council, and with the advice of the Privy Council, they can they can reject things theoretically themselves, but they can do it more practically if they call in the Privy Council and allow them rejection, because the Privy Council will include people who are former leaders of various governments, who are members of the House of Lords, who are former ministers, who are senior admirals, senior generals, senior people from the country. And therefore, if you get their backing or direction, it's not just the monarch saying no, it's a whole load of people who have a lot of experience in the country saying no, and it makes the whole issue of the monarch is being rude against the democratic parliament and it's far more difficult to make the case, because they can go, well, I've called in all these experts and they all agree with me. We think Parliament might not have got this quite right. Which, if you know British English, saying someone hasn't got something quite right is basically equivalent to telling them they have got everything wrong, they are stupid, they should go away and whack themselves several times with a cat of nine tails in self-flagellation because they know nothing. That's not quite right is one of the most damning phrases you can usher in British English. Now, at this point, it's unsurprising that he starts to build his estate in Southhill Park in Bedfordshire and all these things. But here is the interesting thing. He's made First Lord of the Admiralty in 1727. He dies in 1733 in office. Right? Now, why is this interesting? Because George Byng is the First Lord of the Admiralty to survive a change of government. Previously, when you look at the First Lords of the Admiralty, when the governments change, all the ministers change because of the patronage rules, even if they're the internal ones. Now, whilst there is Berkeley, who also theoretically does survive, the Stanhope Sunderland transition to the Walpole Townsend position, he doesn't necessarily count because of the connections he has with Walpole. But Byng, who survives Walpole Townsend to Walpole, really does. Now, when you're in that kind of level of influence and level of capability, and even surviving the change of monarchs from George I to George II, which is, well, technically he's in George II's position, but he's managed to keep his patronage going through Anne, George I and into George II. That's pretty darn crucial in this period. You can survive 3 monarchs and still be a senior officer in the Navy. That's just amazing. My coach, did the Navy Board change? The thing is, they could and they might not. They might not. It's going to depend on the government and how it changes. This is all a lot of politics. And if you think about when he's First Lord of the Admiralty, he's covering quite an important period. Again, we've talked about the War of the Quadruple Alliance. Well, these wars, there is another one in 1727 to 1729, the Anglo-Spanish War. Okay? Again, the Spanish attempt to capture Gibraltar, and the British tried to blockade Portobello, which is just a fun thing. Then there's the Treaty of Seville. And, you know, there are all sorts of other little wars going on. One of the things you find in this period is that there are peace treaties almost every other year because there are wars always ongoing. Again, when you have far more limited tools of discussion and wars don't count in the same way, the wars are easier to start. One of the interesting things is, as you develop more devastating weaponry, one of the interesting things about humans is that the phrase is, if wars weren't so terrible, we really enjoy them, because they're the ultimate challenge of pitting ourselves against each other. Humans are kind of interesting, in that we tend to be very good at war, but we also tend to want to get it done very quickly. We tend to not like it. We tend to be good at it, but not like it. And that's a scary combination, because it means we tend to want to make wars quick. In this period, the most devastating weapon you can have turn up is a ship at a line, because of the sheer amount of artillery it can carry. If you can reach some with ships at a line, you can do a lot of damage. Byng is really the first person to get, improving from what Orford had started off with, to get the system going to the point at which the Navy could realistically be activated as a deterrent methodology. I.e., you can go, well, so, there are problems going on here. Yes. How long till you have your fleet ready? What do you mean? Well, our fleet will be off your coast in about a week's time. When will your fleet be ready? Now, I'm being slightly fatuous with the timetables there. We're usually talking about months. Unless you're taking the guard ships and see the video about the guard ships, which I did on this channel a little while back. But that's the thing you're sort of organising. And again, Byng is leading by details. He's leading by what Orford taught him. Look after the people. Make sure you've got people who will do a good quality job. Yes, they'll work within the system as it exists. That's fine. That's what you deal with. You're not going to change the system. Would you like a dinner or would you like a cannon? Yeah, that's gunboat diplomacy. We have guns, we have dinner. Which would you prefer? I think we want the dinner. So here is an example of someone who really doesn't get it. Okay? Really doesn't get it. Keppel. I've given you two examples of people who work within the system and do it pretty darn well. Augustus Keppel when we've had people who have quite literally, including him before, Augustus Keppel himself, have survived the transition between not just governments of the same political party, but different political parties. Edgemont, you know, it started to get to the point where a senior admiral who's well enough connected, who's well enough included in these things as First Lord of the Admiralty, could survive a government falling. Okay, so you have to you've had Orford keep coming back. You've had Byng survive an actual nasty transition of government, an actual fighting, tearing each other apart transition of government. You then have Keppel. And Keppel does Senior Naval Lord and First Lord of the Admiralty, and he does combine those. But he's interesting. He's really interesting, because when we start to look at his postings in this role, and him operating in this role, well, he manages September 1776 to December 1766, which is 87 days. So can we all suggest that Keppel probably doesn't have much of an impact spending 87 days in post as senior naval lord? He had been made a member of the board of the Admiralty in 1765. So he'd been there from July 1765. He'd been in there a year, over a year, by the time he gets made senior naval lord. He still managed to stay in post for days. Now, I've talked before about the Keppel-Palliser affair. I've talked about the issues he has. Well, he gets involved in too much politics. Whereas the others had been political power makers but had not got involved in the active political role, Keppel is a man of high spirit, of nobility, of profound belief in his views of the world and his vision for making the world better. He does die unmarried in 1786. I knew there was a few who do that, so that's probably why I made a mistake earlier with Russell. He resigned in protest of the Peace of Paris. He didn't like the Peace of Paris. For those who don't know, the Peace of Paris is what ends the war with the United States for their independence. He doesn't like it. This is why he resigns as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1783. He then, after resigning for this, he joins the coalition ministry formed by Lords North and Fox. And when that falls, in December 8, 1783, he's gone. This is why he has such short times. He is probably the last of the overtly, not even really the last of the overtly First Sea Lords, because there's still some Vincent to come. But he is possibly the one whose career and status and legacy in the Royal Navy has most been viewed as being corrupted by the politics. He's not necessarily a good manager of people. And the fact that with the Palliser affair, he praises Palliser in public despite this, being upset with him because he blames him for why the First Battle of Ushant ended badly because of Palliser's actions. In fact, Keppel believes Palliser disobeys orders which cost them battle on political grounds, and that pushes him into politics. There's the honest option that Palliser is just a bad admiral. I'm possibly on that side, but again, the thing is, Keppel isn't as capable as Orford was and Byng were in some regards to work with people from different political backgrounds and make it work. They understood their people and managed them. Keppel does not have those management capabilities, and this is why he's so short. In post. But he tries. He doesn't get much done, though. As you can imagine, anyone in post for this amount of time, when you consider compared to the amount of time that these two have built up, 8 years, 11 days as Senior Naval Lord, 6 years as First Lord of the Admiralty, so 14 years, over 14 years of service in the boards. You imagine the impact he had on the Navy. You go to this gentleman. Well, that's a fairly long time in aggregate. Again, he's got almost 5 years as First Lord Naval Admiralty. Once you add in Treasury and all the other things, he's well on his way to 20 years of service in the boards. Oh, I did the Keppel Palliser affair. I think I did when I did the battle. Yeah. I think I did it during the. I think I did the battle. I did the Battle of Ushant. Yeah, I did the Battle of Ushant. It is. When you get to this level, it's all people management. Leadership is about managing people. It's about working with people. And Keppel wasn't good at it. Now we have another one who's interesting. But here's the thing. Samuel Hood, you'll notice I'm just listing him as First Naval Lord. Today we're talking about the First Sea Lords. Hood doesn't become Sea Lord. It doesn't become Lord of the Admiralty. By this point, when you start to look around the list of the First Lords of the Admiralty, you start to notice a thing, start at a point once you get to pretty much John Jervis and beyond. But even before then, you started to get to an interesting scenario. You've had John Pitt. You started to have civilians enter the role. John Montague, the Earl of Sandwich. Edward Hawke, who was a naval officer, yes. But, you know, the Earl of Sandwich especially has been a good example of it. George Montague, George Grenville. You've had lots of people started coming in who are civilians, who have not had the naval background. John Montague, by the way, 4th Earl of Sandwich, is a really good, really experienced naval administrator who turns up a lot. In many ways, he's going to get an entire video in the Key Admiral series, because whilst he's not an admiral, he works on it. And they have a lot of experience and a lot of capability. But yeah, there's also John Pitt, the 2nd Earl of Chatham, who was a general who served from 1788 to 1794. There was George Spencer, who was also... well, let's be honest. Let's call him a civilian, because he was far more that than anything else. And pretty much at a certain point, the First Lords of the Admiralty start to become, more often than not, civilians and civilian backgrounds. Hood and officers like him are the reason for this, because the reason that you need the First Lord of the Admiralty needs to be a politician, someone who's going to make the case for them in Parliament, who's going to explain the naval case, and you start to realise that these posts start to divide off. When we talk about it, you know, the First Lord of the Admiralty and the First Sea Lord, this starts to become the professional head of the Navy, this starts to become the political head of the Navy. This one is looking at this one is about managing the politics of the Navy. This one is about managing the naval service. Now, they all have a certain level, political level, but there is a reason why eventually the controller is far more politically connected and far more politically important in many ways than the First Sea Lord, despite the First Sea Lord being far more prominent, because the controller has far more largesse in terms of patronage he can hand out to civilians, which is how you can influence various positions. I don't think any of the Hoods were named Robin. Sadly enough. Now, when we start talking about Hood, when we start talking about his capabilities, we have to consider what he was. He was definitely a naval officer. He was definitely an admiral. He was a lord in his own right. He was first Viscount Hood. He'd seen action in the 7 Years' War and the Raid on Le Havre. He'd been taking part in the American Revolutionary War, Chesapeake and Saintes and Mona Passage, and the French Revolutionary Wars, the siege of Toulon and the invasion of Corsica. His brother was the Viscount Bridport. By the way, there are multiple Samuel Hoods. Now, Hood is a capable officer. He really is a capable admiral. But, how do I put this politely? He entered Parliament in 1784. He's elected as a supporter of William Pitt the Younger. He was made Commander-in-Chief of Portsmouth in 1786, promoted to a Vice-Admiral in 1787, and he retires from Portsmouth in 1789 when he's appointed to the board of the Admiralty under John Pitt, the second Earl of Chatham, who was the brother of William Pitt the Younger. Now, he's appointed at the post in July 1788. By August 1789, he's made First Naval Lord. And he also takes on Commander-in-Chief Portsmouth in 1792 as well. Whilst in these roles, he presides over the court-martial of the survivors of the Mutiny of the Bounty in September 1792. Now, he has an interesting role in that. He is very much a hard taskmaster. He is very much a capable officer, but as Naval Lord, he is not an administrator. He is someone who believes people should do what they're told to do. Doesn't believe any persuasion, any politics should come into it. It should all be about, you do this because you've been told to do this. Doesn't necessarily always work. But that's how he works. He's a very hard admiral. He's a good admiral. Don't get me wrong. He deserves the ships that are named after him. He was a mentor to Horatio Nelson, who was one of his frigate captains. And and the reason he gave him patronage was Maurice Suckling, who was Nelson's uncle, was one of his friends. It was Hood who had introduced Nelson to the future King William IV when he was the Duke of Clarence. It was Hood who made sure Nelson would have the connections to get to senior levels. He is good at the patronage side of the Royal Navy, and that's one of the interesting things. He's not good at the admin side, but he's good at the patronage sides of finding young officers to support and promote. He's good at that. But realistically, he's far more comfortable when he's in charge of a fleet than he is on the administration stage. He's one of those officers who should probably never be put anywhere near politics. He has arguments, he has fights. He is a strong personality. Used to action, not... Okay, so let's wind this strangely forward but also backwards. When the Germans were looking at the staff officers and promoting officers in the run-up to World War I, their staff manual is often quoted as having, and this is very much a simplified version of it, that is often quoted, but it's not without basis in truth. Definitions of what you want for senior officers. If you have an active but stupid officer, you get rid of him. If you have an active but stupid officer, you can get rid of him, but they can do junior ranks. A lazy and stupid officer, you don't want them around. If you have a smart but lazy officer, they're destined for the top. A smart but active officer, they're destined for middle rank. Why? Because they're going to want to do things. They're not going to want to delegate, they're going to want to do things themselves. And this was Hood's real problem. He could understand sitting down, talking to people and working out and promoting them, because that was part of the ship's life he could understand. But the administration and organisation and the rest of the thing, he wanted to be doing, and he expected people to be living up to his standards. He wasn't able to necessarily work within the system he was given. And whilst he held it together for 6 years, and he's not bad at holding it, he's not in a bad state. Mostly that's in spite of him rather than because of him. I'd also say his relations with the Navy Board were intriguing, to say the least. He's also eventually relieved of his Mediterranean command. This is after he served on board, because he writes a letter home going, I don't have enough ships. So they decide that, well, we can't send any more ships. We don't want to keep hearing this news of you don't have enough ships, so we're going to just fire you. He was a good officer, though. And honestly, the thing is, he was the sort of admiral who should be out commanding a fleet. He's fine out commanding a fleet in this time period. You need active, smart officers out commanding fleets. You don't want him in charge of the home, because he's going to constantly keep going, but I could be doing that fleet command better, or why is this yard not building faster? If I was here, I would be building 24 hours a day to get these ships built. And they're going, but do you realise how much that would cost in candles? And how much that would cost in labour? And how much that would increase the price of the ship? Why would it increase the price of the ship? It's going to be the same amount of work, whether it's done at night, during the day. No, he doesn't want yes men. He wants everyone to be the same as him. I keep trying to explain this one. He wants people who will do like him. He will quite happily work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 352 weeks of the year, non-stop. And he expects everyone else to be the same. And then when they're not able to deliver that, he gets disappointed in them. This is why he likes people like Nelson, who are going to do that. Nelson's prepared to work himself to the death for the Navy. Why aren't you? Yes, he is the one who all the ships are named for. Let's put it this way. They don't actually have physical fights with the Navy Board, but oh my god, does the relationship get fractious. And the thing is, he has a habit of quite liking to promote officers who are similar to that, which causes other issues. Yeah. Our next example of a First Sea Lord. Sir George Cockburn. Just going to leave it a second for you all to put in the chat what comes to mind with his name. Rick, I'm glad you enjoy my best friend. He's very good, and I am sober. This is Iron Brew, which is a soft drink I'm drinking. This is me sober. So, Sir George Cockburn. Now, why have I picked him out? Why have I picked out George? Cockburn. I am pronouncing it correctly. Now, he'd been at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. He was another experienced naval officer. He'd commanded several ships. He'd had experience in the Revolutionary Wars, Napoleonic Wars, War of 1812. He'd done lots of options. We have a suburb which, yes, how do I put this? There are names which have been changed over times. They get changed. They get transitioned. But yeah. It's amazing how things, pronunciation can get changed. Now, with him, as an admiral, he had experience, and he had been part of a squadron of ships off Cadiz he'd been in charge of, from HMS Marlborough, a third rate. He did a lot in the War of 1812. He was second in command to John Warham, and also to Cochrane. Now, with his experience in naval operations, especially in distant management, he was quite a good pick for First Sea Lord. He'd been elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1820, so he's got some standing in science. He's done a lot of work with that, and he had the job of conveying Napoleon to St. Helena in August 1815. He was a trusted officer, and so, unsurprisingly, he's elected as a Tory, Conservative in modern phraseology, Member of Parliament for Portsmouth in 1818 general election. I can't your face. Now, when he's first elected, he joins what's called the Liverpool Ministry as the Junior Naval Lord in April 1818. Now, the Junior Naval Lord is also what's traditionally called the Fourth Sea Lord these days. And then, of course, disappears. So, the Junior Naval Lord is one of the... there was the Senior Naval Lord, there were various naval lords, and there's a junior naval lord. And usually the junior naval lord is the most recent enter to Parliament, or the most recent to become political. And it was quite normal for the naval lords to also be members of Parliament. You might notice that going along here. Most of we have talked about naval lords. They've not only been naval officers, they've also been members of Parliament. They've had both. Which, of course, is very unusual today. They're not both today. You can't do both roles at the same time today. You can be in reserves and in Parliament, but not in service. Now, he then gets re-elected for Webley in 1820, and is promoted to Major General of the Royal Marine Forces in 1821. Okay? He's made member of the Privy Council in 1827. You can see what's coming on here. So he's a junior naval lord. He's then made Major General of the Royal Marines. He's already a senior admiral, but making Major General of the Royal Marines gives him a further income. One of the things you have to manage when you're promoting people, when you're trying to groom people for senior officers at this point, is you have to make sure they have the money to be able to do the senior roles. And that's part of the thing. The Royal Marines, for quite a long time for the Royal Navy, is this option of, we can give you this senior rank in the Royal Marines, which means we can give you an extra paycheck. There are a lot of captains who also do double duty as senior officer of the Royal Marines aboard their ship, as a way of giving them an extra paycheck. The Admiralty knows this. Now, one of the interesting things is, as a junior naval lord, he actually forces the resignation. This is after he's been elected for a third time, by this time for Plymouth, in June 1828. But while he's a junior naval lord, he forces the Duke of Clarence to resign, as Clarence had acted without the authority of the Board of the Admiralty. Now, Clarence, how do I put this politely? That's quite a big thing to take, because he has forced the future William IV, King of England, King of the United Kingdom, to resign as Lord High Admiral, the post he'd been exercising and been given by his brother. He's a former naval officer. He has a lot of experience, but he's been forced to resign and so exercising the role of Lord High Admiral as the junior naval lord by the junior naval lord, because he has been doing bad things. He'd been appointed officially to Lord High Admiral by George Canning, the Prime Minister, but it's also confirmed by his brother, who's the king at that time. And he basically spends quite a lot of time trying to fight his own board in terms of what Cumberland gets up to, or rather, what Clarence gets up to. Why do I keep calling Cumberland? Clarence gets up to. And whilst he tried to do the best he could, he kept acting without consulting the board. And the board was supposed to be in commission. And so his brother ends up having to request his resignation through the Duke of Wellington. So his brother had appointed him through a Prime Minister, and then his brother has to request he resign through a Prime Minister. That's fun, getting your brother to resign, because basically, as Lord High Admiral, Clarence had wanted to act as if he was Lord High Admiral, when, by this point, you've had the board around for quite a while. And it's Wellington who makes Cockburn, then, after he's done this, the first naval lord. Cockburn focuses on things like gunnery, and forms a gunnery school at Portsmouth. Now, one of the interesting things about him is when he does lose his parliamentary seat, well, when the government falls, he retains his parliamentary seat, and then later on he'll lose his parliamentary seat. But in that meantime, he fights to try and retain a Navy board. Because you might notice, he's in post at a time when the Navy board is being got rid of. 1832. Navy Board disappeared. Navy Board is a god. He fights against that. He doesn't believe the Navy Board should go. He believes the Navy Board is a good thing to have. It's extra posts. It makes sense. He's then made First Naval Lord again during the Peel Ministry. But again, he resigns when the government falls. He's taken the politics the other way. It used to be that when the government fell, they'd automatically get fired because they weren't the right side. He's now resigning because he's not the right side. But in the second Peel ministry, he's then reappointed. And in that, when he's in that one, he started gunnery in his first time as First Naval Lord. Did not much in his second time as Naval Lord, but there again he had December 1834 to April 1835. That's not a lot of time. And his third time, well, he managed to get all the steam systems working. He managed to get all the new ideas on paddles and screw technology, and he was emphasizing transitioning from physical punishment for sailors' misconduct to other forms. He was trying to manage the transition of the Navy from a Navy which was back in, it was pretty much still back in the Age of Sail era, to a Navy which was dealing with the coming of technology, the steam era. And one of the things you have to realize is that with the growing proficiency of the sailors, their capabilities, their skills growing, their ability to get posts elsewhere becomes more of a thing. He's very busy. But the thing is, if they can get duties elsewhere, if they can get jobs elsewhere, they'll go elsewhere. They have opportunities. And so you have to work out how you're going to motivate them. And one of the things you have to do is you have to start lessening some of the sticks. You have to increase some of the carrots, but you also have to lessen some of the sticks. And one of the things Cockburn definitely does work through is is working on the sticks. He's not so necessarily always so good at the carrot side. But he does his best. Again, he resigns from position when the government falls from power. Yeah, again, he's managing in a time of transition. He's worthwhile looking into because he's quite good at it. He's not one of the ones who goes down in history who's really well known about, but he does a lot of the work. And when you start looking at the events, a lot of the things which are keeping scrum out, starting the gunnery school, starting these things. These are things which we think about when we think about the gunnery in the Royal Navy and the importance of gunnery, and how by World War I, gunnery was at such a point that the gunnery officers are pretty much running the Navy. That's thanks to him. We think about the engineering performances, that's thanks to him. He might not have liked the abolishing of Navy Board, but he's a key person around when the Navy Board is abolished to make sure those roles are fulfilled. He's one of the key people who goes, right, and if you're abolishing it, well, these people have to have this. And it's his arguing, which in many ways leads to the Third Sea Lord being set up as it is. Is that moon? Yeah, administrative punishment, stopping of pay, various other things, and also putting in some benefits for good service. Thank you, Seneca Nero. And yeah, thanks Jack Ray for memberships. Now, we have Parker. I thought I'd talk about Parker on a few other times, but really his time as First Sea Lord is 11 days. Literally 11 days. William Parker, First Sea Lord, 11 days. He is appointed in the first, what's called Russell Ministry, the Whig Ministry of Lord John Russell. And he's appointed in their first ministry. Theoretically, he gives up the post after 11 days for ill health. But he then returns to go and command the Mediterranean fleet. So here's my theory about this, right? He had been Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. He had been given command of the Channel Squadron and the Mediterranean Fleet at the same time because of his knowledge of Portuguese politics. He was extremely experienced at senior command abroad. He had served as second naval lord in the Wellington Caretaker Ministry in 1834. That's one of when Wellington, again the general, was prime minister. And he'd served as second Sea Lord in the Melbourne Ministry in April 1835, both short times. He really doesn't like the administration side of the Navy. This man does the quickest. You've made me first Sea Lord. I'll try it out. 11 days. I'm ill. I'm ill. Get me out of here. You will never see. He then goes off and commands the Mediterranean fleet. And the thing is, if you think, okay, well, Alex, he was ill, that's a good reason. He lives till 1857. Another 11 years. He commands the Mediterranean fleet for many of those years. He basically he's out in charge of the Mediterranean fleet. Pretty much, he becomes Commander-in-Chief Plymouth in 1854. His term in the Mediterranean fleet at this point, let's just checking. He commanded from 1845 to 1852. Okay? Technically, his only break in command of the Mediterranean fleet was the allotment to being First Naval Lord while he was Vice Admiral. And his argument for his illness is that he's ill, he has to return to the Mediterranean fleet to get better. Okay? He actually... There is discussion about this. So I should say that there are other versions of the events which I'll put through, but one of the version which I tend to subscribe to, based on the sources I read, is that he literally puts forward the argument that due to his ill health, he needs to be posted to the Mediterranean fleet to get better because he'll be healthier there than in London. I think this is a man who is literally made ill by bureaucracy and administration. Or politics. You can pick. But he has to return to the Mediterranean fleet for his health. I like him. I know a lot of you are going to like him. So he doesn't do much as First Sea Lord, honestly. It's amazing he doesn't get much done in 11 days. Especially when you consider at least 2 of those days were a weekend. I'm just reading through the chat just going, yeah, this is fun. A lot of you seem to quite like Marcus' approach. he's a good admiral. He's going to be mentioned in this years of leadership, but yeah, he has an absolutely, definitely aversion to administration. I mean, literally, I almost think he probably spends more time in these 11 days arguing for the return to the Mediterranean fleet than he does doing this job. Send me back to the command of Mediterranean fleet for my health. Okay. Literally, Richard Winters ran around on the road in front of a machine gun fire at Caratan, but refused to deal with the post-war bureaucracy of the U.S. Army. Yeah. Oh, they're fun. Now, Sidney Dacres. Now, again, he is not one who's going to be spotted a lot, not one who's going to be talked about a lot, but he is definitely one of the cooler admirals, in my opinion, in this who served as First Sea Lord. Now, his experience, well, he actually is the first one we met in this period who has served entirely post-Trafalgar. Okay? He didn't join till 1817. He was 1 year old when the Battle of Trafalgar was fought. He is definitely post-Trafalgar. But his experience in senior command is equally interesting. He was one of the officers who fought ashore in Crimea and who received permission from Queen Victoria, and a special permission, to receive the Legion of Honor from the French. He did all sorts of operations supporting the various fleet operations in Crimea. But after Crimea, well, he gets made Captain Superintendent of Haslar, the Royal Navy Hospital, and then gets the Royal Clarence Gosport Victualling Yard in July 1855 as well. He holds that post till 1858. He's promoted to Rear Admiral after this. And he then was made a post which is kind of an interesting one. You see, the Royal Navy often had an officer who was pretty much chief of staff of a senior officer. And they would have the rank, the traditional rank of this person was captain of the fleet. So you'll sometimes have a Royal Navy flagship, which we listed will having 2 captains aboard. Or will have another senior officer aboard, and they'll be called captain of the fleet. They are basically the Admiral's chief of staff. They had a traditional title of chief of staff. Again, you have this theory, it's often perpetrated that admirals in the Age of Sail didn't have staff. They did. They had all sorts of names for them. So he went off and served as captain. While he's Rear Admiral, he served as captain of the fleet for the Mediterranean fleet on board HMS Marlborough, serving under both Fanchi and Martin, to the vice admirals in charge. Thank you, Seneca Nero. Now, he then was sent off to fly his own flag in HMS Caesar and become second in command of the Mediterranean. Again, this is kind of a normal approach. You would first go and be captain of the fleet, so basically chief of staff and de facto third in command of the fleet, because if anything happens to commander of the fleet, you're the one sitting in the flagship. If you're still alive, you're the one there best placed to A, transfer command to the second in command, and B, if anything happens to the second in command as well, you're the one who's best placed to start communicating with everyone and tell them what to do, because everyone's already going to be looking at your ship. This is the thing. So de facto third in command of the fleet. And he gets second in command of the Mediterranean, and then he goes to the Channel Squadron. And he holds that post till June 1866. And while he's in charge of the Channel Squadron, he's in charge of integrating ironclads into the fleet. At this point, you might be going, Alex, he hasn't gone anywhere near the Admiralty. You're right. He's got no previous experience at this point. He's gone nothing. He has worked in various positions. He's worked with various senior officers. But he hasn't gone anywhere near the Admiralty. He's made a Vice Admiral in November 1865, whilst he was in charge of the Channel Squadron. And then he becomes a Commissioner of the Admiralty and Second Naval Lord in July 1866. Think about that. He's Second Naval Lord in July 1866. He becomes First Lord in December 1868. So he's pretty much gone from Captain Superintendent in 1855 to First Lord of the Admiralty as a Vice Admiral in 1868, 13 years later. This is where you get the interesting thing. He's promoted to Full Admiral while he's First Lord of the Admiralty. And this is not unusual again. Because of the politics around the point, sometimes they do not pick full admirals, and they want to use the full admirals for going off and commanding fleets in wartime. Especially some of the important fleets. Or they would rather keep them ashore because they're expensive once they're deployed. So you often find vice admirals being used for these roles. Modern parlance, 3 stars. Rather than 4 stars or 5 stars. Would be using for this role. We'd think in this period, people often think, well, surely it's the more senior admirals. No, which does cause interesting points. This is one of the reasons why the rank of Sea Lord is so important. Because whilst they're a Vice Admiral and technically junior to a Full Admiral and shouldn't give them instructions, as a Sea Lord, a Lord Commissioner of the Navy, they outrank the Vice Admirals, etc., when it comes to issuing orders, and the Admirals when it comes to issuing orders. Now, one of the interesting things he does in this is he's very much a caretaker. He is very much a status quo, keep the changes that are going, keep the movement going, but not do too much. But he does do something interesting as First Lord. He starts to push for more education of officers. He does start to push that. He starts to push for leadership to listen to junior officers more. It doesn't work that well, and we all know what happens to Tyrion and others later on. But I'll talk about that in a second, Alex. But what he is pushing for is the abolition of masts. That's the big thing he's pushing for. That masts should go. And if we think about it, he is First Sea Lord when the Devastation class are commissioned in 1871. Well, they're launched in 1871, they're commissioned in 1873, but basically he's managed to get them through. Which one was commissioned in 1870? Yeah. He's the one who managed to push them through. Now, Alex, if you don't mind, is this where a faction system that Drakenfeld mentioned about their relationship to innovation, conservatives, modernists, and all in between? Yeah, it's... How do I put this? There are factions within factions. So what you have to understand is, A, their views on technology might not reflect their political positions. So they could be a Tory/conservative in political connections, but they could still be wanting to modernize the fleet with technology. They could be a liberal and wanting to keep to traditional traditional. So that's always fun. You also have a scenario whereby there will often be there's often a factionism going on throughout this period, in terms of you're going to have promotions going on for senior officers. But at a certain point, the Navy has got to a level of professionalism whereby naval lords do not resign because of governments. They are professionals. So whilst the Lords of the Admiralty will change because they're the political heads, the Sea Lords don't change by about this point. Now, sometimes they do because they choose to get involved in politics still. And this is one of the things. There is a long transition period where you have officers who choose to not get actively involved in politics. They have political connections, but they don't get actively involved in politics. And they will survive the changes of government. And you get others who will resign because they're very passionate about their politics. And you get others who literally are sacked because of their politics. But it's slowly transitioning to the point to which the Navy's becoming a professional service, whereby the politics, you are serving the nation, not the government. Okay? And that's an important point of transition. That, in many ways, is one of the reasons why the preservation in Britain of the monarchy at least proved very useful. Because you were an officer of the crown, not the government. Your loyalty was to the monarch, not to the government. And yes, he has some background and experience in ironclads. He had some involvement in terms of their integration into the Channel Squadron and how they were added in the new fleet, and he kept that going. One of the things you have to realize is that sometimes you need an officer who's not going to be revolutionary. Because, okay, whilst it's a nice thing to talk about with technology, constant revolution, as a leader, you've got to know at some points you've got to bed down and see what the technology's doing before you make the next step. Keep jumping onto the latest technology. A good example is the British Army recently, okay? The British Army jumped from decision to decision to decision about their vehicle fleet. And it meant they're constantly changing priorities, constantly changing programs, and failing to deliver anything. And eventually, the funny thing is they went full circle and ended up getting Boxer again. Which was the program they originally dumped because it didn't fulfill their needs, and then it came round circle and they were actually buying them. And we also got Ajax and all that fun going with that. And the reality is, a lot of that happened because every senior officer who came in wanted to make their stamp on the program and to deliver the very best technology you could get at that point. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there's also a thing of, at a certain point, you have to go with the technology you're getting to actually get something delivered. And the thing is, Dacres is one of those officers who actually realizes that, and he implements that. He's gone, right then, we've got the technology, we've got the ironclads coming in, we've got things like HMS Warrior, Black Prince, all these vessels coming in. That's great. Let's keep them coming. Let's see how they work, and then we'll work on the next generation. And so you need to, so you do it. That's what they're doing. They are working on it and working through that generation so they can understand that. Cac, the reason I've got the ads on is because I find with my system, and I don't know, I can't explain it for others, but when I don't have ads running, and if I forget to run them, if I'm doing it manually, which I often do, then suddenly my system starts flashing up that it's not getting enough data. There's not enough data coming through. I don't know if they're connected. I don't know at all. All I know is that when I turn on the ads, I don't seem to get the same problems. So that's why I have to have the ads running. I have the ads because, especially if you're a smaller channel, below 100,000 subscribers, it seems to me if you don't have ads turned on, you don't get any promotion in the logarithm at all. When I've done videos in the past with no ads turned on, they literally went nowhere. And then I do an ad on a very similar topic video, turn on ads, and oh wow, that got a few thousand views. The previous one with no ads basically didn't seem to even get promoted to my subscribers. And when you consider YouTube system now doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get your videos of the people you're subscribed to promoted to you. That seems to be a thing where they are promoting what they think you like rather than rather than what you've signed up to. If you aren't running ads, it really, really seems to cut you down. So I'm just working with the system. I have these conversations with the rest of the Shipshape crew on a regular basis. We try our best. We try to work it out. We're doing the best we can. YouTube Premium does help. YouTube Premium is probably one of the best things you can do because YouTube actually if people get it, actually one of the things it differential monitors channels is whether you get higher, whether your viewers are more premium than regular, and it seems to promote channels again which have a higher level of premium viewership. It's a very important transition period. And he does well on it. You know, he manages stability. If you think about it, yes, we can talk about how stultifying the Victorian Navy is getting, how the Edwardian Navy is having issues. We can talk about all that. But yeah. You okay, sis? Can hear you. He was the appropriate officer in his time, and yes, he wasn't quite as revolutionary as people might want. He didn't push on some of the fronts that people might want in terms of education and leadership and reforming the naval system. But he was trying to get the best out of the naval system with what he had available, with what was going on. And again, he's a technological pusher. He really does push the technology. But it's kind of interesting that he comes through the Royal Navy Hospital and the victualling yard. He's come from the logistics side. Don't ask. My sister's in the utility room doing some weird stuff. Yeah, he's part of the balancing the advancement of tradition and keeping things going. I was just checking she was okay. Now, our next officer is Richard Vesey Hamilton. And if you've noticed, there is a link in the pinned comment in YouTube and in Twitch, which is to his book. Yes. When he had to retire, and he did have to retire in 1891, he wrote a book. He was, he had experience. He had been Director of Naval Ordnance in 1878. After he'd been made a Rear Admiral in 1877, he commanded the Ireland Station, he'd commanded the China Station. He'd taken his fleet into Vladivostok to surprise the Russians. He'd had done all sorts of operations. He'd been promoted to full admiral in October 1887. His first service in the Naval Lords had been Second Naval Lord in 1888, and then he becomes First Naval Lord in July 1889. This is a period where it's quite common to have people serve as Second Naval Lord and then get promoted to First Naval Lord. It's quite common to do that, to go that route. Now, one of the interesting things is he has a report. And he commissions a report and gets a report put in forward about where the Royal Navy should be, where its ships should be disposed of, where they should have unarmoured ships, and whether they were in difficult positions of meeting the threat from any other two powers. He is the officer who puts forward the idea of the two-power standard in many ways. And he is the one who puts forward the case and starts working with the Naval Lord, the Lord of the Admiralty at the time, and various other ministries to work through the Naval Defence Act of 1889, the two-power standard. That's what he managed to get implemented. He takes over from Sir Arthur Hood, by the way. But he's a good officer. He is a good officer. And if you start sort of thinking about that, in terms of what he's doing and how he's working a role, he's very much pushing the broader thing of the Navy as a strategic service, the Navy as its role, and how it's adapting to technology again. He's dealing with the tail end of what had been started with the integration of ironclads. Okay, now pretty much everyone has ironclads. Are unarmoured ships any use? What are we going to do? Are any ships built to the old standard any use? And he doesn't necessarily have the easiest time, because remember, he's in post during a conservative under George Goshen ministry. Salisbury is the Prime Minister at the time, Lord Salisbury. George Goshen is not really the keenest person when it comes to spending money. Hang on. No, he's George Hamilton, who also wasn't keen on spending money. This is the trouble with having so many Georges. Why are they all called George? Please note, this was something I was watching the other day, and it really doesn't help with dyslexic historians. They're all called George. George Hamilton at this point. George Goshen is the guy who argues with him later, who's also the first lord, the first Lord of the Admiralty. So George Hamilton is his first lord, and he's first lord from 1886 to 1892. So he's actually in post longer than Vesey is, than how Richard Hamilton is. And he's not so keen on spending money. So Hamilton really has to make the case quite strongly to him. Now, as we all know, later on, Fisher will make even a policy of scrapping even the ships that Hamilton has put in, because, you know, they're now too old for modern services. We have to get rid of these, and we're going to build these new big modern ships, and we're going to have less ships to go around the world. Well, in some ways, Hamilton's having to do this earlier on. He's doing an earlier version of that. Oh, frigate. How are we going to run the world? We have got this massive empire around the world we've got to defend. And, yeah, we've got ships which really can't match up. I think there's just a period in nicest way where everyone just goes, I don't know what to name my kid. George. Oh, that's fine. My family managed to avoid the Georges somehow. Somehow. Now, when he leaves his post, when he leaves his role as First Sea Lord, he's obsessed with naval education. And he becomes president of the college at Greenwich. And as said, he writes a book. Naval Administration, the Constitution, Character and Functions of the Board of Admiralty, and the Civil Department it directs. Now, interesting enough, this became pretty much a de facto Bible for people wanting to study the Admiralty and work with the Admiralty for the next roughly decade and a bit. What's really interesting is that many of the recommendations which are hidden within it, when you read it, and the criticisms and suggestions, you will find are what are implemented from later in the 1910s when they want to reform the Admiralty. As I've said before, when talking about Admiralty reform and changing the ministry, there are many people who realise what's wrong with the Navy and what's wrong with their lacking in staff. There are people who are putting forward the case. They just don't always get the attention. Richard Hamilton is an admiral who really doesn't get the attention. But, again, he's had some interesting experience. He did take part in the Second Opium War. Always nice to know you fought to give drugs to people. Broadly speaking, though, his career was about maintenance of the empire, maintenance of stability, maintenance of presence. In good service. And he had commanded HMS Achilles, which was a pretty cool ship in itself. It's one of the earlier ironclads or armoured frigates of the Royal Navy. She's a nice ship. She is a nice ship. It's that thing of being both cost-effective and effective. Yeah. And it's a balancing act. And the reason why the two-power fleet comes in, it's rather like the two-ocean Navy Act. You put the two-power standard in, you put it into a defence act, you suddenly have a legitimate reason, even without immediate threat of action, to go, we need to build more ships. You're justifying constructing ships in peacetime without making it an overt statement. You're not picking on anyone, you're just saying, right then, we have to have the same number of ships as the next two powers combined because of the size of empire we have. It's nothing personal. The fact that that means we have the same number of ships as Russia and France combined, who are allies, well, we'll leave to one side. As always, Alex, when we finish, I will do both some open questions on this, and then I will do... I'll pop to Discord, so you can pick which one you prefer to ask me the question on. And now we have another example, and this is Sir Charles Madden, the forgotten First Sea Lord of the 1920s and the 1930s. The one who basically sits in the middle and people go, who was it? Because he comes after Beatty and before Field. Now, Madden is a very interesting officer because, well, he was brother-in-law of Jellicoe's wife. Okay? So I think that sort of makes him his brother-in-law as well, by my count. Because basically, Jellicoe was married to one sister, Madden was married to the other sister, and so I think that makes them brothers-in-law. I think. That's how my maths works out in terms of familial relationships. And Madden was at this point supposed to go and join the become Third Sea Lord, but instead he goes to become Jellicoe's chief of staff. So Madden is almost third Sea Lord. He's going to be made third Sea Lord. And you know how important that post is. I've talked about it before. He would have been third Sea Lord in 1914. But instead, he's sent off to be Jellicoe's chief of staff. That's how important it is. There's not that much difference in them in terms of their ages. But, you know, there's enough. And he does well. He does well as Jellicoe's chief of staff. He's often Jellicoe's main intermediary with the politicians and the press, and making Jellicoe's designated hitter when he has issues and he wants things to sorted out. And yes, he does quietly carries the Navy in a fairly difficult peacetime. He's then given command of the 1st Battle Squadron and second in command of the Grand Fleet after Jellicoe moves on from the Grand Fleet. Yeah, Madden is put in a post to basically watch BT. He's good at it. When BT takes down his post, finally hauls down his flag as Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet in 1919, and the Royal Navy's put into a peacetime fitting, a peacetime sort of organisation, Madden is appointed to command the Atlantic Fleet, and he gets HMS Queen Elizabeth as his flagship, which had formerly been BT's flagship. So he has to deal with some of the things going on there. It's not until, therefore, 1922 he gets promoted to First and Principal Naval Aide-de-Camp of the King, which is an important posting. At this point, that's become a shining light that you are... So, in some companies, they will have, you are a candidate for the next executive officer. You're a candidate for an executive officer, right? If you are made a First and Principal Naval Aide-de-Camp to the King, or Queen... that has historically been, since that post has been created, a bit of a... you are likely to end up as a First Sea Lord. You are likely to end up as a senior officer. And the post came into existence in 1830. And it's... went on till about 1972. And then it was united with the post of First Sea Lord. BT is coming into this, but he's coming in around us. He's promoted to an Admiral of the Fleet in 1924. So he's promoted to the highest rank you can get, 5-star Admiral, in 1924, as in serving in the Royal Navy. And he's then given command of the Committee on the Functions and Training of the Royal Marines in 1924. This is a point at which I find him interesting, because he very much wants to move the Royal Marines towards a brigade structure, independent of some of the ships, in terms of doing the mobile naval basing force and protecting that. And it's interesting, if some of the ideas he had suggested had been followed to their extension, you would have had a Royal Marine division landed with every one of the naval basing formations. In which case, Crete and various other things would have been very different in World War II if you'd had a full division to land with them, rather than what was basically a light brigade. He wants a far bigger, far more heavily organised organisation. Now, he takes part in that committee and pushes forward the Royal Marines. He then gets put another committee on the executive officers list of the Royal Navy to try and work out that in 1925. There's important things going on in 1925. There's various axes coming, so you need to be sure you're retaining the good officers and do your best to retain as many of the good officers as you can. Finally, he's made First Sea Lord in 1927. Now, the thing is, he gets to be... in a bit of a pickle at this point. Because he's First Sea Lord when you're starting to work out agreements for the London Naval Treaty. Now, if you remember, the London Naval Treaty is intriguing. It is really intriguing, especially when you're talking about a navy which requires at least 70 cruisers for its wartime duties. Now, with that as a requirement, the British agreements in this scenario are pretty interesting once you start adding up the tonnages, because what are the British allowed? What are the Americans allowed? What's everyone allowed? Well, the British are allowed 146,800 tons of 8-inch gun cruisers, so that's basically 15 of them, and 192,000 tons of 6-inch cruisers. Now, theoretically, that's more than 19 of those. But if you think about it, that's still not going to be a lot. Even if you're talking 8,000 ton cruisers, that's going to be what? 24 and 15. So he's accepted a very big limit on his cruiser numbers. And yes, you're allowed to keep some overage ships as well for other cruiser duties. And there are other limitations put on the cruisers. And basically, he sits there and makes the case that he's had to accept it because of the political position of the Royal Navy and the issues they have in working out what the future is going to be, and because the government is so focused on reduction of spending. But he also makes the point that accepting a parity United States in form of roughly 50 cruisers was fine because he only had 48 cruisers which he'd actually value in a war anyway. Now, yes, this is the scenario which does lead to the tribal class destroyers and various other things the Royal Navy studies in terms of putting in ships, and I've talked about that in my own book. But he has trying to thread the needle and hold the Royal Navy together through it. It's not an easy task. And one of the reasons why he's forgotten, I would argue, a lot is because he managed to do it in such a way that he preserved the Navy's strength enough, but he made no one happy. He made everyone equally unhappy with him. And making everyone equally unhappy with him, whilst it was probably best for the Navy, means there's no one really to shout his chorus. I would say his issues were, he was following on from Beatty, who had a lot more political clout and was a lot better at politics than Madden. Madden was the better admiral, Beatty was the better politician. And Beatty had already established the practice of giving ground in the Washington Naval Treaty. It's arguable Beatty could have fought for more. In the Washington Naval, it's interesting to point out that in the Washington Naval Treaty, the British were in some ways had a stronger political position in Washington than they did at London Naval Treaty, because at Washington they established the precedents which then are pushed on at London. So if you establish a stronger precedent at Washington, you have a stronger position at London. Now, there is the fact that once you read through it, you realise the British have written the text heavily, and there are various things which really do suit the British position in both Washington and London Naval Treaty, which is something which is worthwhile remembering when people complain about them. But most of the numbers which fill up his extra ships are the overage ones. If you consider at this point, there are lots of ships which are considered overage and therefore don't necessarily count towards strength. definition for overage. Oh, let me just find that one, because I have the actual definition. I always have the text. Overage. That was. That's not in that section. That's which section is that in? Age of ships. Oh, let's just go up to the. Let's go to this point and just find it out. No, not there. Not Article 8. It wasn't. Oh, which of the teams is it? Oh yeah. Okay. It's in Annex 1 Rules of Replacement, isn't it? So. Overage vessels. Once a vessel is any surface vessel exceeding 3,000 tons but not exceeding 10,000 tons is considered overage if it had been laid down before the 1st of January 1920 after it's 16 years old, so it's from 1936 onwards. If it's laid down after the 31st of January 1919, 20 years old. For a vessel which is less than 3,000 tons, it's considered overage if it had been laid down before the 1st of January 1921, after 12 years, and it's 16 years if laid down after the 31st of December 1920. Submarines were considered overage after 13 years. You are not allowed to put down replacement tonnage until something is considered overage, but you are allowed to retain overage ships. Okay? You are allowed to retain overage ships because that is considered less combat capable. So, basically, what we're talking about is in 1930, any ship which is laid down before 1920, which he thinks can be viably modernized, will be classified as overaged by 1936, and therefore it can add to the force. This is going to be C-class cruisers, D-class cruisers. The E-class, I think, were just in it, weren't they? From memory. This is the joy of being dyslexic. You never trust your memory. They'd been launched December 1919 for Enterprise. And yeah, they were both in it because they were both launched well before. They'd been laid down well before. And yeah. So pretty much his gamble is that A, the Americans won't build up to the limit, and B, he can make his 70 ships by modernizing his overage ships. But he's got to accept for political reasons with the government, he can't have all the new ships he wants. Instead of having 70 modern ships, which was the limit which he was supposed to be arguing for, he accepts, well, yeah, we're going to accept roughly 50. And I'm going to have to make up the rest in overage units. Destroyers do count to the build limit by this period. London Naval Treaty increases the limitations down to destroyer levels. The interesting thing, which no First Sea Lord really pushes for, and I find annoying, the Third Sea Lords try and push for it, not just Henderson, but others, are sloops, which are allowed under 2,000 tons and supposed to be designed not for a speed greater than 20 knots. The fact they can often do faster than 20 knots will leave to one side. Yeah. 9631, the Dido class was supposed to replace the C&Ds in their frontline role, not in their secondary role, in the roles they would serve in during World War II. In their secondary roles. Because the thing is, again, Like the Royal Navy's wants to expand to 20 plus capital ships by 1942 is their aim. Because that's the end of the 10-year rule. The 10-year rule was ended in 1932 and practically ended in 1937, and so they need to be war ready by 1942 they're going based on the information they're given. So they want to get to 20 cavalry ships. They also want to get to a certain number of cruisers. They want to get to, well, there's a debate on how many. They're definitely aiming for more than 70. There's an argument by some that they were aiming for 100 cruisers by 1942. I don't think they were aiming for that high across the various in the Royal Navies when you look at the cruisers build, but I think they're aiming for more than 70, considering they're keeping a lot of their overage ships in service and modernising them. Sloops to Avisors. Avisors are pretty much sloops in a different name. Sloops are not limited in cumulative tonnage. You can build as many of them as you like. So spam them, and no one can argue with you. Basically, if you want to, especially because if they are roughly the same size as destroyers, so they're going to take the same power plants as destroyers. You just put governors in them, so they're not designed to be more than 20 knots. Just wait 5 minutes to be out of port after commissioning and just to go, so what happened to the governor, Chief? I have no idea. Okay. So, there are issues which can be resolved quite quickly in that design. The point is, if you do span them, if you do, let's say, build 16 a year from 1930 onwards, or even so just keep building 16 a year every year from the end of from the Washington Naval Treaty onwards. They were your lead for ASW warfare. They're your lead for convoy escorts, and suddenly you don't have to keep them always keep them in service. You can stick some of them in reserve. Sloops were also the minesweepers and mine layers. They were patrol ships. They were humanitarian relief. They were converted to merchant ships by some companies when they bought them. They were pretty unuseful hulls. It's going to be a net positive for the fleet, but they don't. Yeah, 20 knots in the worst sea state. But yeah, he's a good, stable pair of hands who tries to reach the best decision he can. And honestly, his leadership style, though, is more Jellicoe than Beatty, without Jellicoe's ability to organise the politics, and without Beatty's flair for the politics. Anyway, questions. I'll do questions for roughly half an hour, and then roughly half an hour if people have got questions, and then I will take a little sort of bio break, and then I will be on Discord. Too bad it is bad the E's stopped to 2. They would have been useful ships, but again, it's when you start looking at them. What was the next E class cruiser was if you consider Emerald is all single guns. Enterprise has a twin gun turret forward, and then 5 singles. Euphrates seems to be going to have even more of those twin turrets. Yeah, it's interesting. It's basically you can argue they are leading into what would have been an early version of the Leander class. Question: what's the difference between a sloop and an aviso? Nothing. Not really. Aviso is usually more of a Mediterranean-orientated French design or Italian design. But they do pretty much similar roles. It's just their different phraseology. It's like I've ignored Knight's question in there because sloops are arguably successors to the old later age of sail steam corvette. Honestly, when you look at them in that period he's talking about, I think it's a he. I almost think Knight's a he. Sloops are pretty much doing that role as well. You have corvettes and you have sloops, and they're both doing it. It depends which navy you're talking about, what they're calling it. So, yeah. The differential between sloops and corvettes really comes about in terms of major thing in World War II, when corvettes mean it's full merchant build, sloops mean it's full naval build, frigate means it's half merchant, half naval build. It's a combined thing. Arguing for small ships is always an issue for the Royal Navy. Thank you, Team Loco. Arguing for small ships is always an issue which they have to push through. It's often more easy to argue for large ships because they're going to be large employment and they're going to be visible, and you can make the case to the government. But also, the fact is, you also have the problem if you're making small ships is if the government might go, well, we'll fund 4 ships this year. Well, the thing is, a small ship you can build a lot more quickly than you can a big ship. You can train a crew for a small ship a lot more quickly than you can train a crew for a big ship, in terms of getting it to work, and because of the missions and various roles it's going to be called upon. So usually you'll go, right, and I'll get the big ship built. If you're going to give me... It's like the case with the Royal Navy aircraft carriers. People often go, well, should they have been this? Should they have been that? Well, they were offered 2 ships. They could, whatever they wanted they could have, but they would only have 2 of that. So you're going to get the biggest carrier you can with the Queen Elizabeth class. That's what the Royal Navy pushed through. And then there was an argument made, oh, we don't want to invest in the yard. So they couldn't go for the size they really wanted, the slightly larger size. They had to go for a size which would fit in that yard. Because the political requirement was you can have any 2 ships, but they have to be built in that yard in Scotland. Okay, so you do that. And it's often the case in history that you've had periods where, especially in peacetime, when Navy's told, right then, we're going to fund 5 ships this year, what ships do you want? You're only going to fund 5. We're going to go for the 5 biggest you'll give us. Because when there's a war on, if we go, we want a lot of small ships, you'll throw money at us, we'll get the small ships. And we might get them in time for the war. But if you want the big ships, you're not going to get them in time. So you need to build them in the peacetime. There's some good stuff out there on the T-races and clipper ships. But it's also one of those areas of history which, because it is merchant marine, the history is often in little tidbits everywhere. You've got some bits in the ship design history, you've got some bits in the economic history, you've got some... Where are my books on T-clippers? I have some books. I have a couple of books somewhere. I'll try and hunt them out in time for brew ships on Sunday. So I have them to show them off in brew ships. But I'm sure I have some T-clipper books around me. Ay, caramba. Oh, thank you, Jonathan Moon. Oh, that's okay. In your opinion, who was the least effective Sea Lord in his position? Who did at least something? If we disregard the... Ooh. St. Vincent causes a lot of issues. St. Vincent caused a lot of issues. Beatty causes issues because he basically surrenders naval aviation for a few years. But he did a few interesting things. But St. Vincent causes issues. The trouble is, most of the admirals we sometimes deal with, the ones who do the really bad stuff are usually famous for doing the really bad stuff. Vincent is kind of famous for how bad he is as First Sea Lord. He causes all sorts of issues with the Navy Board. He almost causes the Royal Navy to have a shortage of ships at several points because he mucks around with them so much. Okay, let's see. Stephen Nichols, Nicholas, submarines have no consequences in these calculations. Well, that's the thing. Every time the Royal Navy makes the case for submarines, the case for ASW warfare, especially with sloops, etc., because sloops are the primary ASW weapons of the Royal Navy in many, many ways, along with destroyers. Basically, the scenario that comes up whenever they're trying to make the case is the government goes, well, if you want sloops, you don't get destroyers. And destroyers are allowed to be faster than 20 knots, designed to be faster than 20 knots, and have torpedoes. But they are limited in the number you can build by treaty. So the Royal Navy basically goes, right, then we'll build destroyers then. The Royal Navy would like to build destroyers and sloops, but it's trying to make the case for both with the Treasury. Especially when the Treasury, if you think about it, prior to World War One, the Royal Navy's making the case for submarines, but no one really has the mental demonstration of how dangerous they are. World War One, they come far closer to winning the war with submarines than they do in World War Two. But in the run-up to World War II, in most of the 1930s, in 1920s, 1930s, the big threats, Japan and Italy. Italy you can steal off the Mediterranean. Japan is the other side of the world. They can't really get to many British shipping routes if you can keep them in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and Pacific. The British shipping routes are all Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, Atlantic. That's the big major British Empire shipping routes. The cross-Pacific shipping routes are not that massive for the British to deal with. So they don't really have the same case. And you have to remember, the German fleet in 1939 doesn't have a lot of submarines. It really doesn't. They ramp up production during the war massively to get to the submarine fleet they have 1941, 1942. But 1939, 1940, they really don't have a lot of submarines. And the British are already ordered, prior to war, they are ordering the Flower class, they're ordering the Hunt class. So yes, they do have these, they do eventually get that funding. But the trouble is, it's making the case in the 1920s, 1930s. And honestly, most of the politicians are usually going, well, Wood, every time there's a naval treaty, we try and get submarines outlawed. What more do you want us to do? And they're going, well, we'd like to fund the ASW ships. Yeah, but it's at that point it's a political argument, and it's the Third Sea Lords who have to lead that argument in many ways, and they do their best. But basically, the sloop program becomes, in many ways, the tester, as I discussed before, of what are we going to put in corvettes, what are we going to put in the mass build ships. We're going to test it out with small runs of sloops to work out and find out what works for ASW warfare, to find out what works for minesweeping, to find out what works for all these things, and then work it through. Twitch Education seems a section is specific to a game of the same name. Dang. That's sad. Alliance, but the difference of you can build 100,000 tons this year or you can build 5 ships this year to what to build. Well, that's a different thing. If you're putting it as 100,000 tons, I probably build a balanced force, a mixture of ships. If you're putting it, I can build a number of ships, well, I'm then going to build the biggest ships I can get my hands on. I'd say everyone, they had other ships serving that role. That's the thing. Why did they build only a couple of Calypso class? Well, if you look up the Calypso class, they're cute ships, but they've been preceded by the Commerce class, which were preceded by the Bacchante class, which were preceded by the Emerald class, which were preceded by HMS Rover, which was preceded by the Amethyst class. And you look at them and what they're building, and the Virga class, and you go through all these vessels, and the Royal Navy's building quite a lot. And you can go back all the way to, well, the 1860s. And the trouble is, a lot of these ships could still do it. And what you need to do with sloops wasn't necessarily speed. Remember, the sloop is not the fast ship on the station. The sloop is basically the gunboat on station, the present ship of, hello, we're turning up for the friendly greeting, because what we do is we demonstrate that there are bigger ships can get here. But we're going to get here as a reminder we have bigger ships. Was there any say for a Sea Lord in where to build ships? A lot of it. The third Sea Lord had a lot of power in that role. I mean, they were third Sea Lord and controller. They would often be the ones who award the contracts, and they would pick. There is quite a reason why the town class of 1930s are ordered for the yards they are, and the town class of 1910s are ordered for the yards they are. It's a employment thing, but also it's a methodology of making sure that they can't be cancelled, because if you put them in key constituencies which have low employment, but the shipyard will keep a lot of people employed building a Royal Navy ship, that will work. And they do the same with the county class cruisers. In fact, the biggest protests for when the county class cruisers are cancelled because of various treaties come from the unions, come from the shipyards, going to the government, going, hang on. This is going to cause unemployment. Alright. So, any more questions? I will say something I've enabled on my system. I think I have enabled viewer posts on the community tab. I've decided to enable it as it's under the same restrictions as comments, but there are viewer posts there. Hopefully that will be interesting for people, and people enjoy using the community tab. I'm not sure what the kind of post that can come up, but I'll be interested to see what happens. Also, is it possible to explain in a few words how exactly feedback on a ship behavior works? I like a new class released and something happens. How does the Admiralty process feedback? Well, there's first going to be trials. You have to remember the Royal Navy doesn't take a ship over a ship ownership until it's passed through its trials. So there's going to be a trials crew aboard the ship first to make sure it fits the standards that are required. Then usually a senior officer is appointed to the first in class when it comes into service, and they will write a manual about how to operate the ships in that class. Now, this becomes more viable once you get onto the later build of ships. And this is one of the interesting things which I didn't really discuss enough in last video about what happens if you have more research funding. Because one of the interesting things people point out to me was they kept going, well, number of engines being tested doesn't work like that, because to get 100,000 hours, it's 100,000 hours of a single engine, so we can find out how it works for 100,000 hours. And that's right, that is definitely the modern way, and that's probably the methodology you've got from about 1930s onwards. But when you're talking about 1900s, 1910s, one of the things they're testing for in those engines is that they work across a standard design. Because if you think about it, they've only really started standardizing engines quite recently in the 1900s. This might sound scary to say, but have a look at the ships which were even in the same class. They'd have the engines built by different builders, and they'd have completely different engine characteristics. But yeah, I have enabled the creator board. So yeah, a lot of the testing's done. And then they have various methods of sort of receiving messages. Also, can First Sea Lord act authority make very... Yes and no. In theory, the First Sea Lord can be authoritarian, but in practice, you have to remember if the board can get rid of the king's brother if he's dictating to them and not acting with their permission, imagine what they can do to anyone else. So, yeah. There is a theoretical... And you will get people who are more powerful. Admiral Fisher's a good example as First Sea Lord. He's more powerful because of his political connections, etc., and his ability to make his case. He's more threatening. But even then, his First Sea Lord will still exercise a significant amount of power and independence. And so, the thing is, the First Sea Lord is theoretically the senior officer and the senior service representative. And theoretically everyone's boss. And they all salute him. But they also all have their jobs to do. And one of the worst things you can have as a First Sea Lord is technically as a senior, another member of the Sea Lords resign and stay there resigning because of you. That can cause you political issues. So it's always about managing your personnel. It's always about managing your relationships. So being authoritarian, St. Vincent is a good example of this. His many issues come because he is very authoritarian. And by then, the board and the Navy had already moved beyond having an authoritarian First Sea Lord. And that's one of the problems for admirals, because especially admirals in Age of Sail, but even in the Victorian era, at sea, the senior officer's word is God. They are, as far as they're concerned, they're in absolute command. And then they come back to being on the board, the Admiralty board, and suddenly they have to deal with politicians, they have to deal with civilians, they have to deal with the other members of the board. And it's very much not a scenario where you're able to be so dominant. And yes, I'll be on Discord after this. As I said, I'll just have a quick bio break and then I'll go to Discord. Anyway, people appear to have finished their questions for the evening, so I will say thank you very much, everyone. Take care. I'm off to, as I said, have a quick bio break, and then I'll be on Discord in the general chat, chatting away with people for a bit. I'm not sure how long, but probably you'll do a good 45 minutes in there to answer questions. So, anything else we've got coming up to interest you all? Well, this week we've got Lord Howard of Effingham on the 4th, leading a disparate band. He's an interesting leadership personality to look at, because, let's be honest, anyone who tries to keep that band of ruffians that the Royal Navy England put together to deal with the Armada, actually working together is an intriguing mix. Very much an intriguing mix. Take care, everyone. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for the super chats and memberships. Thank you, everyone, for your support. It really means a lot. I paid my tax bill today. Oh god, it's always a bad day. On a run up to the 31st of January and July, it's always terrible when you pay your tax bill. You have money in your account and then it all goes, and you have nothing left in your account. Oh, the tax bill. Death and taxes, they're always coming for you. Take care, everyone. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Gustav, Stalin Profiling, Jonathan Moon, Alex, Rat to Rat, Stafford, Jack Ray, Wayne, Runon, all the admins who've been on, all the people who've been on both Twitch and YouTube chatting away, Jonathan Moon, Tim O'Neill, Timu Locker, everyone, thank you for doing this evening. Thank you for being nice to everyone. Thank you, Lions. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for chatting away. It's always fun to have people chatting away, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found it interesting. Take care, everyone, and have fun. Toodles. And as said, I'll be on Discord shortly.